There is a moment buried deep in Ark Raiders lore where everything you thought you understood about Blue Gate gets flipped on its head, and this video exists because that moment deserves about 8 hours of your undivided attention. I put this video together because Blue Gate kept showing up in my research as this thread I couldn't stop pulling. Every document, every terminal log, every piece of scattered environmental storytelling in Ark Raiders pointed back to it in some way. The more I dug, the more I realized that the community had mostly been treating Blue Gate as a backdrop, a location, a setting, rather than what it actually appears to be, the center of Ark's entire operational philosophy. So I made a choice when assembling this. I deliberately excluded the broader Ark invasion timeline from the first half of the video and focused almost entirely on what Ark itself seemed to be doing, not what it was doing to us. That reframing changes everything. What you're going to hear over the next 8 hours is my interpretation of the lore, built from in-game documents, environmental clues, and the kinds of details that are easy to miss on a first playthrough. When I say something suggests a certain reading, I mean exactly that. This is a constructed narrative, not a confession from the developers, but I think it's a convincing one. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1: Before the Sky Broke. Blue Gate did not start as a military installation. That is the first thing the lore suggests, and it is one of the most important details to hold on to as we move through everything else in this video. The documents scattered across the early zones of Ark Raiders paint a picture of a facility that was originally built for industrial logistics, a kind of massive transit hub designed to move goods and personnel through a region that was otherwise difficult to access. The terrain around Blue Gate, judging by the environmental design and the references in worker communications, was rugged and isolated, the kind of place you built a hub precisely because nothing else was nearby. What we can piece together from maintenance logs and worker communications is that Blue Gate had multiple phases of construction. The earliest references talk about it in purely logistical terms: shipment manifests, worker rotation schedules, complaints about the cafeteria, normal stuff. But there is a transition point, and it is not subtle once you know to look for it. At some point, the language in the documents shifts. References to civilian personnel start to drop off. References to clearance levels start to appear. The cafeteria complaints stop, which might sound funny, but it actually points toward a workforce change. The question of when Blue Gate transitioned from a logistics hub to something more classified is genuinely interesting because the lore does not give you a clean answer. One possible reading is that the transition happened gradually, almost bureaucratically, with new wings being added under different authorization codes, while the original structure kept operating as normal. Another reading is that a specific event triggered the reclassification, and the civilian workforce was quietly reassigned or phased out. The documents support both interpretations, which is part of what makes this facility so compelling to dig into. What seems clear is that by the time Ark showed up, Blue Gate was no longer what it had been built to be. The bones of the original structure were still there: the loading docks, the transit corridors, the maintenance infrastructure, but layered on top of all of that was something newer, more deliberate, and considerably more protected. We are looking at a facility with multiple identities, and Ark arrived during a period when the newer identity was very much in charge. The environmental storytelling in the approach zones around Blue Gate is worth paying attention to here. The fencing patterns, the checkpoint remnants, the positioning of what appear to be observation structures, all of it points toward a facility that was designed to control access from multiple directions simultaneously. This is not how you design a logistics hub. This is how you design a place you do not want people leaving without permission or arriving at without being seen first. Ark Raiders as a game is deliberately sparse with its direct explanations. The developers have clearly made a choice to let the world speak through its ruins rather than through exposition dumps. That is a design philosophy that rewards the kind of deep reading this video is trying to do. but it also means we have to be honest about the gaps. And one of the most significant gaps in the early Blue Gate lore is the absence of any clear documentation about what, specifically, the facility was studying or housing during this classified period. There are hints, though. There are always hints. One document category that appears more frequently in the Blue Gate Zone than anywhere else in the game involves references to environmental monitoring. Not security monitoring, not personnel monitoring, but actual atmospheric and geological data collection, readings, measurements, logs that record changes in specific variables over time. The variables themselves are redacted in most instances, which is frustrating, but the fact that this kind of monitoring was happening at all is suggestive. One possible reading of those environmental logs is that Blue Gate was positioned specifically because of what was already happening in the surrounding terrain, not because of what could be built there, but because of what was already present. If you are monitoring something, you tend to monitor it from as close as possible. The facility's location, which seems impractical from a pure logistics standpoint, given the terrain challenges referenced in the early worker documents, starts to make more sense if the location itself was the point. This is where the lore starts to layer in interesting ways. Blue Gate may have been a logistics hub first, because that was the cover it needed, or because that is genuinely how it started, and the classified layer came later when something was discovered. Either way, by the time the world of Ark Raiders reached the state we play in, Blue Gate had become something that warranted significant Ark attention. And Ark, as we will spend a lot of this video exploring, does not give significant attention to things without reason. The human element of the pre-Ark Blue Gate story is easy to overlook, but it matters. There were people here, not just workers moving crates, but researchers, analysts, personnel with specific skill sets and clearances. The lore suggests these people had lives at the facility, not just jobs. There are references to personal quarters, recreational spaces, the kind of infrastructure you build when you're not planning to rotate your workforce out every few months. These were people who were meant to stay. What happened to them is one of the questions that hangs over the entire Blue Gate storyline. The facility is a ruin by the time we encounter it. Whatever the workforce was doing, whatever the environmental monitoring was tracking, whatever the classified operations were producing, all of it was interrupted. And the interruption was not clean. The evidence of rapid departure is everywhere in the physical space. Half-eaten meals, personal items left behind, equipment left mid-operation. The timing of that departure relative to the first Ark incursions is something the lore handles carefully. It does not give you a straight answer about whether the people at Blue Gate left because Ark was coming, or whether Ark came because the people at Blue Gate were doing something that drew attention. That ambiguity is probably intentional. It is the kind of narrative gap that keeps you asking questions. What we can say is that the departure happened fast. The evidence does not suggest an organized evacuation with proper protocols and signed out equipment. It suggests people decided very quickly that staying was not an option. That kind of urgency implies either a sudden external threat or a sudden internal one. Given everything else the lore suggests about Blue Gate, neither possibility can be fully ruled out. The physical architecture of Blue Gate rewards exploration specifically because of this history. You are walking through a place that has at least 3 different functional identities layered on top of each other. The original logistics infrastructure, the classified research layer, and then the emergency state of the departure. Reading the space means understanding which layer you are in at any given moment, and the transitions between them are genuinely fascinating. The loading docks, for instance, show clear signs of having been repurposed at some point. The original flow of the space, designed for moving large freight, has been interrupted by the addition of checkpoints and monitoring equipment that make no sense in a pure logistics context. Someone added controls to a space that was not designed for them, which suggests the reclassification happened after the original construction, rather than being planned from the beginning. In contrast, certain interior sections of Blue Gate show an architectural sophistication that does not match the rest of the facility. These are spaces that were clearly designed from scratch for a specific purpose, built with different materials, different ceiling heights, different lighting infrastructure. They feel like a different building that got inserted into the middle of another one. That kind of construction typically means significant budget and significant urgency. Someone needed this space, and they needed it quickly enough that they could not wait to redesign the entire facility around it. These interior sections are also where the environmental monitoring equipment is most heavily concentrated. If you pay attention to the equipment clusters in these areas, you start to notice that a lot of it is oriented in the same direction, not toward the surface, not toward the sky, but toward a specific point in the subsurface. Something below Blue Gate was being watched very carefully. That detail alone could sustain an entire separate video, and we will return to it in later chapters when we start looking at what ARC's forces specifically prioritized when they began their operations at the facility. For now, the point is simply that by the time the world of ARC raiders reached its current state, Blue Gate was a place with a secret, possibly several, and at least some of the people who knew those secrets had left in a hurry. The broader world context matters here too. ARC raiders does not take place in a vacuum. The ARC incursions that define the game's setting were not localized events. They happened globally, with varying intensity and varying consequences depending on the region. But the lore consistently suggests that certain locations receive disproportionate ARC attention, and Blue Gate is clearly one of them. When you compare the ARC presence at Blue Gate to the ARC presence at other locations referenced in the game's documents, the density of ARC activity at Blue Gate is striking. This is not a location that ARC passed through. This is a location that ARC specifically targeted and then maintained a sustained presence at. That kind of deliberate resource allocation tells you something about how ARC was prioritizing its objectives and what those objectives were. There is a school of thought in the ARC Raiders community that ARC's targeting of specific locations follows a pattern related to pre-existing human technological development. Under this reading, ARC goes where humans were already doing interesting things, because the interesting things humans were doing had either attracted ARC's attention or had created conditions that ARC wanted to exploit or interact with. Blue Gate fits this model very well. But there is another reading, and it is one that I find more compelling, for reasons we will get into as this video progresses. Under this alternative reading, ARC's interest in Blue Gate predates the incursion itself. ARC did not target Blue Gate because of what humans were doing there. ARC targeted Blue Gate because of what was already there before humans built anything at all. The human activity at the site was, in this reading, almost incidental to ARC's actual interest. That distinction might seem subtle, but it has massive implications for how you understand ARC's goals and behaviors throughout the game. If ARC is reactive, responding to human technological development, then its behavior is fundamentally comprehensible in human terms. We do things, ARC responds. We can potentially anticipate it, work around it, maybe even negotiate with it. But if ARC is pursuing objectives that are entirely independent of human activity, objectives rooted in something that was already present in the landscape, then we are dealing with something whose motivations we can only ever partially understand. The Blue Gate law, taken as a whole, points more toward the second reading. And that is a genuinely unsettling conclusion to sit with as we move forward. There is one more element of the pre-ARC Blue Gate history that deserves attention before we move to the next chapter. And it involves the question of who else knew about Blue Gate. The classified nature of the facility implies a need-to-know system, and need-to-know systems always leak. The law contains references to outside parties who were aware of Blue Gate's existence, and, more interestingly, aware of at least some of what was happening there. These references are fragmentary and easy to miss, but they are present. Who those outside parties were and what they knew is something we will explore in detail later. For now, the important thing is simply to note that Blue Gate was not as contained a secret as its security infrastructure might suggest. Information got out. The question is whether that information reaching the wrong ears had any connection to what eventually happened at the facility. The final thing to say about the pre-ARC period at Blue Gate is that the lore is deeply ambivalent about what the people there were actually trying to accomplish. There is no document that clearly states the facility's mission in plain language. Everything is oblique, referenced sideways, described in the language of bureaucratic abstraction, that real classified projects actually use. This is either very good world building or a very deliberate narrative choice to leave the interpretation open. I lean toward the latter. The game's designers know what Blue Gate is. They have made a choice to let you figure it out through accumulation rather than declaration. And the accumulation, when you add it all up, paints a picture of a place where people were trying to understand something they were not fully equipped to understand, something that was already underway long before they arrived. The weight of that framing becomes clearer once Ark shows up, because when Ark arrives at Blue Gate, it does not behave the way it behaves at other locations. It does not simply overwhelm and move on. It settles. It organizes. It starts doing things that look almost purposeful in a way that Ark behavior elsewhere does not quite match. And that purposefulness, as we are going to spend a long time arguing in this video, is the key to understanding what Ark's actual goal at Blue Gate was. One of the most important documents in the early Blue Gate lore is a maintenance report that seems entirely mundane on first reading. It is a record of structural anomalies detected in a subsection of the facility, the kind of document that would normally be filed and forgotten. But the language used to describe the anomalies is interesting. The writer is clearly trying to describe something they do not have adequate technical vocabulary for. They are reaching for analogies, describing things as similar to known phenomena, while noting that the similarities do not quite hold. That document is dated significantly earlier than you might expect, well before any of the other classified layer documents, which suggests that whatever was being observed in that subsection of the facility was being observed very early in the facility's history, possibly from the beginning. The anomalies were not a new development. They were an ongoing condition, and someone was keeping records of them long before the classified infrastructure was built around them. The picture that emerges from all of this is of a location that was fundamentally different from its surroundings in ways that were noticed very early, studied increasingly seriously over time, and eventually deemed important enough to warrant the construction of a significant classified research infrastructure, all before Ark ever arrived. Whatever Blue Gate's secret is, it is not an Ark-created secret. It is a pre-Ark secret that Ark recognized and came to claim. That is where Chapter 1 leaves us. We are standing at the beginning of a very long story, one that starts before the game's timeline, before Ark's arrival, possibly before much of the human activity at the site. The foundation is laid, the facility exists, the secret exists, the workers have fled. And somewhere in the ruins, Ark has made itself at home, for reasons that have nothing to do with the cafeteria, or the loading docks, or the clearance levels, or anything else the original builders thought they were managing. Ark found what it was looking for at Blue Gate. The rest of this video is about what that was. Chapter 2. The shape of Ark's interest. Understanding what Ark wanted at Blue Gate requires understanding something about how Ark operates as an entity, and the lore is genuinely careful about not making Ark too easy to interpret. This is one of the things I find most interesting about Ark Raiders as a game. It resists the temptation to give Ark a simple motivation. Ark is not the alien invasion of a summer blockbuster. It is not trying to colonize Earth or harvest resources in any conventional sense. What Ark is doing is harder to name, and that difficulty is the point. The documents scattered across the Blue Gate zone contain references to Ark behavior that consistently puzzles the human observers recording it. There are logs from survivors who watched Ark forces at the facility, and the consistent thread through those observations is confusion. Ark was doing things that looked deliberate, but that the observers could not map onto any recognizable objective. They were not stripping the facility of materials. They were not fortifying it in standard defensive configurations. They were not studying human technology in any obvious way. What they were doing, according to these observations, looked more like searching, not in the frantic, urgent way you search when you are under pressure, but in the methodical, patient way you search when you know roughly what you are looking for, but need to locate it precisely. Ark forces at Blue Gate were moving through the facility in patterns that suggested a systematic survey. They were going everywhere, but they were spending much more time in some places than others. The places where Ark spent the most time are interesting to map. If you track the references to ARC presence in different sections of the facility across the various observer documents, a geography of ARC interest emerges. The loading docks, the surface infrastructure, the civilian quarters, minimal presence. The classified research wings, significant presence. The heaviest concentration of ARC activity in the entire facility. That concentration is not random. ARC forces were not distributed evenly across Blue Gate. They were weighted towards specific areas, and those specific areas correspond almost exactly to the areas that the pre-ARC classified research had been focusing on, which raises an obvious question. Did ARC know about the pre-ARC research, and was it following that research's lead? Or did ARC arrive at the same areas of interest through its own independent assessment? The law does not give a definitive answer, but there are clues that point in a specific direction. One of the observer documents contains a detail that is easy to miss: a description of ARC forces arriving at a location in the facility that was not marked on any known facility map. The observer notes that the ARC units went directly to this location without any apparent searching or hesitation. They knew where it was. They went there first. If ARC knew the location of an unmarked space in the facility, that knowledge did not come from human documents. No map of the facility that the observers had access to included that location. The implication is either that ARC had intelligence about Blue Gate that exceeded what the human research team had documented, or that ARC was able to perceive the location of interest through means that did not rely on human documentation at all. The second possibility is the one the law seems to nudge you toward. ARC's interest in Blue Gate appears to be based on its own perception of the site, rather than on any inherited human knowledge about it. ARC found the interesting things at Blue Gate because ARC could sense them, not because ARC read the files. This has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between ARC and the specific anomalous conditions at Blue Gate. If ARC can perceive those conditions directly, then ARC's interest in the site is fundamentally different from the human interest in the site. The humans were studying something they could detect instrumentally but not perceive directly. ARC, it seems, could perceive it directly. That difference in perceptual access changes the power dynamic of the situation enormously. It also suggests that ARC's behavior at Blue Gate was not exploratory in the way human research is exploratory. Humans at the facility were asking questions. ARC may have already had answers, or at least had access to the same fundamental phenomenon that the humans were trying to understand, and was doing something more active with that access. The question of what ARC was doing with that access is the central mystery of this chapter, and it is one we have to approach carefully because the law is deliberately vague on the specifics. But there are structural clues in how ARC organized itself at Blue Gate that suggest something about the nature of the activity. ARC forces at Blue Gate did not behave the way ARC forces at comparable facilities behave. At other locations referenced in the game's lore, ARC tends to establish clear perimeter control, standardized processing of the physical space, and relatively uniform patterns of activity. At Blue Gate, the behavior was more differentiated. Different ARC units seemed to have different roles. Some maintained perimeter control, but others were doing something inside the facility that the perimeter units were not involved in. That internal differentiation of ARC activity is unusual according to the observer documents. People who had watched ARC operate at other sites noted that Blue Gate was different. There was a hierarchy of activity there that they had not seen elsewhere. Some ARC units were clearly subordinate to others, deferring to certain units in ways that suggested those units held some kind of priority status. The priority units, in the observer's accounts, were consistently associated with the subsurface-oriented areas. These were the units that ARC seemed most invested in protecting and most focused on facilitating. Everything else at the facility, the perimeter work, the surface presence, appeared to exist in service of what the priority units were doing in those specific locations. One possible reading of this organizational structure is that ARC had dispatched specialists to Blue Gate, units with specific capabilities or purposes that were distinct from general ARC forces. The differentiated behavior suggests differentiated function. And differentiated function At a site of specific interest suggests that whatever Arc was doing there required more than just Arc's standard operational toolkit. If Arc sent specialists to Blue Gate, that tells you something about Arc as an organization. It implies a level of internal differentiation that goes beyond what most simple readings of Arc as a monolithic entity would suggest. It implies that Arc has different kinds of capabilities that it deploys situationally, and that Blue Gate was a situation that warranted a specific category of capability. The word specialists is a human frame, of course. We are projecting human organizational logic onto something that may work in entirely different ways. But the observed behavioral differentiation is real, and it needs to be accounted for in any coherent interpretation of what Arc was doing at the facility. Another important element of Arc's behavior at Blue Gate involves timing. The law contains references to specific intervals in Arc activity, periods of high intensity, followed by periods of relative dormancy, which then cycle back into high intensity. This cycling behavior was noted by multiple observers and remarked upon as strange. Arc elsewhere did not cycle in the same way. It either maintained consistent activity levels or escalated over time. The cycling at Blue Gate was distinct. The intervals of high activity at Blue Gate appear to correspond, at least roughly, to specific external conditions. The observers who noted the cycling also noted that the transitions between phases seemed to be triggered by something rather than following a fixed schedule. Something caused Arc to shift into high-intensity mode, and something caused it to dial back. The nature of that trigger is not clearly documented, but several observers note that the transitions seem to correlate with changes in the physical environment around the facility. We are back to the environmental monitoring theme again. Whatever Blue Gate was positioned to observe, whatever the pre-Arc research had been tracking, that same phenomenon appears to have been cycling in ways that Arc was responding to. Arc was not on its own schedule. Arc was on the site's schedule. That is a remarkable thing to consider. It suggests that Arc's activity at Blue Gate was not autonomous in the way we might expect. Arc was not simply doing what Arc decided to do. Arc was doing what the conditions at the site were dictating. Arc was responding to something rather than directing it, at least in terms of the timing of its activity phases. This reactive quality to Arc's behavior at Blue Gate cuts against the image of Arc as an all-powerful, unilateral actor. It suggests something more interesting, that Arc found at Blue Gate a phenomenon that it could not fully control, only respond to. And Arc's goal was perhaps not to direct that phenomenon, but to position itself advantageously relative to it. The human research team at Blue Gate had been doing something similar. They could not control what they were monitoring either. They were positioned to observe it, to measure it, to document its changes. The parallel between the human research posture and Arc's operational posture at the facility is striking, and probably not coincidental. Both humans and Arc arrived at Blue Gate because something was already there. Both adopted postures of observation and response, rather than control and direction. Both invested significant resources in maintaining proximity to the phenomenon. The difference is that Arc has capabilities the humans did not, and Arc has been at it longer, with more patience, and presumably with more of an idea of what it is dealing with. The law hints at another layer here, which is the question of other Arc sites. If Blue Gate is characterized by a specific anomalous phenomenon, are there other locations in the game world where comparable phenomena exist? And is Arc present at those locations in similarly distinctive ways? The answer, based on scattered cross-references in the documents, appears to be yes. Blue Gate is not unique as a type of site. It may be the most significant example, or the most accessible to us as players, but the pattern of Arc behavior it represents seems to be repeated elsewhere. That repetition implies a systematic Arc awareness of these sites that predates the events of the game. Arc did not discover Blue Gate and then have to develop new approaches for it. Arc came to Blue Gate already knowing how to handle this kind of situation because it had handled comparable situations before. The organizational sophistication, the specialist deployment, the patience with the cycling phenomenon, all of it speaks to experience. Arc has done this before, where it has done this before, and what the outcomes of those previous instances were, is information the law does not readily provide, but the implication of experienced, systematic engagement with a specific category of anomalous site is an important one. It changes the scale of what we are looking at. We are not looking at a local incident. We are looking at one node in what appears to be a much larger pattern of arc activity. Bluegate was important enough to warrant specialist deployment and sustained engagement. What made it important, as opposed to other comparable sites, is a question the later chapters of this video will try to address. For now, the key point is that Ark's interest in Bluegate was genuine, deliberate, and differentiated from its interest in other human-built locations. Bluegate was special to Ark, and Ark's behavior there shows it knew that. One of the observer documents that I find most evocative in this context is a brief personal log, rather than an official report. The writer is watching Ark from a concealed position and trying to describe what they are seeing in a way that makes sense. At one point, they write that the Ark units they are watching look less like soldiers and more like workers. Not in a comforting way, they are quick to add, but in the sense that they appear to have a job to do, and they are doing it. The violence and the threat are not the point. They are incidental to the work. That observation stuck with me. It matches the broader pattern of Ark behavior at Bluegate that the law describes. Ark was not at Bluegate to destroy, conquer, or even particularly to eliminate humans. It was at Bluegate to work, to do something specific. The hostility toward human presence was a byproduct of that work, not the objective. Understanding Ark as a worker at Bluegate, rather than as an attacker, changes how you frame every piece of evidence we're going to look at in this video. A worker has a task has a goal. And a goal, if you can understand it, gives you a framework for predicting behavior, understanding choices, and eventually, maybe, figuring out how to interact with it. The task Ark was performing at Bluegate, the specific goal it was working toward in those subsurface-oriented sections of the facility, is what the rest of this video is fundamentally about. We have established the site, we have established the interest. Now we need to figure out what Ark was actually trying to accomplish there. What follows from here is necessarily more speculative, because the lore gets more fragmentary as it approaches the core of the Bluegate mystery. The closer you get to what Ark was actually doing in those priority areas, the less direct documentation exists. This is either because the documentation was destroyed, because the observers who could have made it did not survive long enough, or because the developers have deliberately left that space open for interpretation. Whatever the reason, we are going to spend the rest of this video working from the edges of what is documented toward the center of what it implies. The picture that emerges will be incomplete, because all pictures of this kind are incomplete, but it will be a coherent picture, assembled from the best available evidence, and it will be more complete than any version of the Bluegate story that stops at the surface level. The shape of Ark's interest is becoming visible. It is a shape defined by patience, by specificity, by differentiated capability, and by responsiveness to something that was already at the site before anyone else arrived. The shape points downward, toward whatever it is that Bluegate was built over, and toward whatever Ark understood about it that the humans never quite managed to figure out. Chapter 3. The documents that don't add up. Every major lore investigation in a game like Ark Raiders eventually hits a wall made of contradictions. You find a document that says one thing, and then you find another document that says the opposite, and suddenly the clean narrative you were building starts to crack. Bluegate has more of these contradictions than anywhere else in the game, and this chapter is where we dig into the ones that matter most. The first contradiction worth examining involves the timeline of Ark's arrival at Bluegate. Multiple documents in the zone establish what appears to be a clear sequence. Ark arrived, Ark overwhelmed the surface defenses, Ark moved into the facility. Standard incursion narrative, but there is a subset of documents, mostly personal logs rather than official records, that suggest a different timeline. These documents reference Ark presence at or near Bluegate before the official incursion date. Not a full incursion, but presence, observation, something that predates the main event. If those personal logs are accurate, then the official incursion at Bluegate was not Ark's first contact with the facility. It was Ark's move from observation to action. That is a meaningful distinction. It implies that Ark had been watching Bluegate before it committed to taking it. And watching something before you take it implies that you are assessing it, learning it, deciding what approach is warranted. Ark was not surprised by what it found at Bluegate. It had done its reconnaissance first. Why would Ark need reconnaissance? The standard model of Ark behavior does not include careful advance assessment. Ark incursions are generally characterized as overwhelming and direct, not patient and observational. If Ark was behaving differently in advance of the Bluegate action, it was because Bluegate required different handling. This loops back to what we were discussing in Chapter 2 about Ark's specialist deployment and unusual operational patterns at the facility. If Ark identified Bluegate as a special case early enough to conduct advanced reconnaissance, then the specialist behavior at the facility was not a response to discovering something unexpected. It was planned from the beginning. Ark knew what was at Bluegate before it ever formally moved on the facility. The second major contradiction involves the facility's defenses. The official records describe a facility with significant defensive infrastructure, appropriate for a classified research installation. The personal logs from people who were actually at Bluegate tell a different story. Several accounts describe defenses that were not functioning, systems that had been deactivated or compromised before the Ark incursion began. The contradiction between what the facility should have been able to do and what it actually did when Ark arrived is significant. One possible reading is simply that the defenses failed in the chaos of the incursion, which does happen, but the personal logs suggest something more specific. Certain systems were not just non-functional, they appeared to have been deliberately disabled. Someone turned things off before Ark got there. Whether that was a betrayal, a precaution, a misguided attempt to avoid provoking conflict, or something else entirely, the law does not say clearly, but the pattern of disabled systems was noted by enough observers independently that it cannot be dismissed as individual error. The third contradiction is perhaps the most interesting. It involves the question of what Ark took from Bluegate and what it left behind. In most incursion scenarios, Ark processes locations fairly completely. It does not leave significant resources or infrastructure intact without a reason. Bluegate, however, shows a striking pattern of selective preservation. Certain areas of the facility were clearly subjected to intense Ark activity and are now heavily damaged. Other areas are remarkably intact, preserved in a way that does not match general Ark operational patterns. The preserved areas are not random. They correspond to specific sections of the facility, sections that, based on other documentary evidence, appear to have been associated with specific types of research or monitoring activity. Ark preserved the things that were relevant to its own interests and let the rest go. This selective preservation is evidence of a degree of facility-specific knowledge, an operational discrimination that reinforces everything else the law suggests about Ark's approach to Bluegate. But here is the contradiction embedded in that preservation. Some of the things Ark preserved appear to be things that should not have survived the intensity of Ark activity in adjacent sections. The boundary between heavily damaged and carefully preserved areas is sometimes sharp to a degree that seems physically implausible. It looks, in some of the observer accounts, less like careful operational discrimination and more like something was protecting those areas from the inside. Something that was not Ark. What that something might be is a genuinely open question, and one of the most intriguing threads in the Bluegate lore. The possibility that the facility itself had some kind of active resistance to certain types of damage is suggested by the physical evidence, but the lore is careful not to confirm it directly. It is one of those details that hovers at the edge of documentation, present enough to be noticed, absent enough to be deniable. The fourth contradiction worth examining is in the Ark behavior timelines within the facility. We established in Chapter 2 that Ark activity at Bluegate cycled between high and low intensity in ways correlated with external conditions. But within those cycles, the law contains accounts of Ark behavior that does not fit the pattern. There are moments of very high intensity activity that occurred outside the expected high phase periods, seemingly triggered by something internal to the facility rather than external conditions. These anomalous intensity spikes are described in observer accounts with a consistent emotional register. They were disturbing to witness in a way that the regular high-intensity phases were not. The regular phases felt purposeful. The anomalous spikes felt reactive, almost panicked. Arc forces during those spikes were moving differently, with less of the methodical quality that characterized normal operations, and more of a quality that observers struggled to name, but consistently described as urgent in an unfamiliar way. If Arc could experience something analogous to urgency or disruption, and if Blue Gate was the location that triggered it, that is a significant data point. It suggests that Blue Gate was not just a site of Arc objective pursuit, it was a site where Arc could be surprised, where the conditions could generate responses that deviated from the standard operational pattern. Blue Gate was, in some sense, unpredictable even to Arc. The fifth contradiction is the one that ties all the others together. It involves the question of completion. Most Arc operations at specific sites reach a point where Arc's activity levels drop dramatically, suggesting that whatever objective was being pursued has been achieved or abandoned. At Blue Gate, based on the available timeline documents, this completion moment appears to have occurred at some point. Arc activity levels dropped. The cycling pattern changed. Something changed in the operational picture. But the facility does not look like a completed operation. The preserved areas are intact, but apparently unused in any final sense. The subsurface-oriented monitoring equipment, where it survives, still appears to be in an operational state. Arc forces remain at the facility, but in a configuration that looks more like maintenance than achievement. Whatever completion means for an Arc operation, what happened at Blue Gate does not look like the standard version of it. One possible reading is that Arc achieved a partial objective and is waiting for conditions to allow completion of the rest. Another reading is that what Arc found at Blue Gate changed Arc's plans in a way that reorganized the whole operation around a new set of goals. A third reading, and the one I find most compelling, is that Arc reached a threshold at Blue Gate and discovered that crossing it required something Arc does not currently have access to. But reading suggests a stalled operation rather than a completed one. Arc at Blue Gate is not done. It is waiting. And what it is waiting for may be connected to the human presence at the site, the raiders who operate in that zone, and the ongoing fragmented world of Arc raiders as we currently experience it. The contradictions in the Blue Gate documents are not bugs in the law. They are features. They are the places where the official record and the lived experience diverge, where the bureaucratic documentation of events and the personal observation of events tell different stories about what actually happened. Every real historical event has this quality. The official record is always incomplete and always shaped by the perspectives and interests of whoever is maintaining it. In the case of Blue Gate, the official records appear to have been maintained by people who either did not have full information about what was happening or who had reasons to document some things and not others. The personal logs fill in the gaps. But personal logs have their own biases and limitations. The truth of Blue Gate, as the law constructs it, lives in the space between these different types of documentation. Reading that space requires the kind of lateral thinking that good law investigation demands. You have to hold multiple accounts simultaneously, note where they agree and where they diverge, and ask what kind of actual event could produce both sets of observations. The Blue Gate story that emerges from this process is more complicated and more interesting than any single account suggests. The contradictions also do something important narratively. They prevent you from settling into a comfortable explanation. Every time you think you have Blue Gate figured out, another document complicates the picture. This is not frustrating in the way that sloppy law is frustrating. It is engaging in the way that a genuinely complex mystery is engaging. The game knows what it is doing here. There is one more contradictory element that deserves attention before we close this chapter, and it is one of the most personal and specific pieces of documentation in the Blue Gate law. It is a message, or what appears to be a fragment of a message, from someone inside the facility to someone outside it. The sender is not identified, or the identification has been obscured. The recipient is not clear. The content is mostly illegible or redacted. What remains of the message contains two things that are clear enough to work with. First, a reference to Ark being here for what we put there. That phrase is remarkable. It implies that the human activity at the facility did not just attract Ark's attention, it created or placed something that Ark specifically came to retrieve or interact with. Second, a reference to the gate itself, not as a location name, but as a description. Blue Gate may be named for something that is literally there, some kind of boundary or threshold that the facility was built around. The phrase, what we put there, combined with the reference to a literal gate, is the kind of lore fragment that can reorganize everything else you know about a subject. It suggests human agency in creating the conditions that Ark came to Blue Gate to address. It suggests that the anomaly at the site was not entirely natural or pre-existing, but was at least partially the product of human action. And it suggests that the facility's name means exactly what it says. What was the gate? What did humans put there? How did Ark know about it? These are the questions that drive the remainder of this video's investigation. The documents that do not add up are pointing at something, and the something they are pointing at is the gate itself. Chapter 4. What was below Blue Gate? The subsurface dimension of Blue Gate is where the lore gets genuinely strange, and strange in a way that feels intentional, rather than accidental. Everything we have discussed so far, the environmental monitoring, Ark's concentrated interest in specific areas, the message fragment about what we put there, all of it converges on the question of what was happening below the facility's surface level. The environmental monitoring logs, which are some of the earliest documents in the Blue Gate lore, consistently reference measurements taken at depth. The specific depth varies across documents, which is itself interesting, as if the point of interest was not at a fixed location, but distributed across a range, or as if the measurement methodology changed over time. But the consistent orientation of the monitoring toward the subsurface is undeniable. What was being monitored is where the lore becomes deliberately opaque. The variables being tracked in those logs are either heavily redacted or described in terminology that has no obvious real-world equivalent. This is a common technique in science fiction world building, creating the impression of a coherent technical framework without defining that framework so precisely that it can be critiqued. In Ark Raider's case, the technique works because the fragments you do get are evocative without being explanatory. One set of measurements that appears in multiple documents involves something described in terms of connectivity or linkage. The language is relational. Measurements of how strongly one point is connected to another, or how the nature of that connection is changing over time. This relational framing is unusual for physical monitoring data. You do not typically describe geological or atmospheric phenomena in terms of connectivity. That language implies something more like a network, a structure of relationships rather than a physical condition. What kind of natural or constructed phenomenon would be described in those terms is an interesting puzzle. One possibility from the game's wider lore context involves Ark itself, which is frequently described in network terms in documents that discuss its nature and capabilities. Ark is not experienced by the human characters as a collection of discrete units, but as something more systemic, more interconnected, something whose parts are in constant relation to a larger whole. If the measurements at Blue Gate were tracking the strength or nature of a connection to Ark's network, the monitoring program makes much more sense. You would want to know if that connection was getting stronger, if it was stable, if it was changing character. That kind of monitoring would be exactly the basis for a classified research program, and exactly the kind of information that would make Blue Gate a site of exceptional Ark interest. But this interpretation raises an immediate problem. If humans at Blue Gate were monitoring a connection to Ark, how did they know such a connection existed? Ark Raider's lore generally presents the first human encounters with Ark as a shock, an overwhelming and largely incomprehensible arrival. The image of scientists quietly and systematically monitoring a pre-existing Ark-connected phenomenon does not fit that standard narrative of first contact. Unless Blue Gate represents a different story of first contact. Not a dramatic arrival, but a slow realization. Not Ark coming to humans, but humans accidentally finding the edge of something that had been there all along. The monitoring program at Blue Gate could be the record of humanity stumbling into awareness of Ark's extended presence in the physical world before Ark made itself unmistakably visible. This is a reading that the law supports but does not confirm. The dates are suggestive. The framing of the research in terms of anomaly and unusual phenomenon, rather than threat or attack, is consistent with a pre-contact discovery, and the facility's location, which seems to have been chosen for proximity to the monitored phenomenon rather than for strategic or logistical reasons, fits the model of a research program that organized itself around a naturally occurring phenomenon of unclear nature. The gate language from the message fragment in the previous chapter becomes much more charged in this context. A gate is a boundary between two states or spaces. If what was being monitored below Blue Gate was a connection to something on the Ark side of the world's order, then the facility was literally positioned at a gate, a point of passage or contact between the human world and whatever Ark's substrate actually is. That framing Blue Gate as a literal boundary site is consistent with Ark's behavior at the facility in a way that helps explain the sustained operational presence, the cycling intensity, the specialist deployment. Ark was not at Blue Gate because of something humans had built or found. Ark was at Blue Gate because Blue Gate sat on a boundary of fundamental importance, a point of connection or passage that Ark needed to manage or influence. The Human Research Program had been studying this boundary from one side. Ark arrived to engage with it from the other side, or perhaps from a position of already understanding what it was in a way the humans never managed to. The question of what the boundary connects to is the deepest question in the Blue Gate lore and the hardest one to answer. The game does not provide a clear cosmological map. It does not tell you what Ark is in the way that classic science fiction might tell you what the aliens want. But the accumulation of detail about connectivity, about depth, about the relational nature of what was being monitored, suggests something like a substrate, a fundamental layer of the world that Ark has access to, and humans were beginning to detect. There is a document in the Blue Gate zone that I have returned to more times than any other in this research. It is not dramatic. It reads like a dry technical note, but it contains a phrase that I think is the closest the law ever comes to explaining what Blue Gate was actually sitting on. The phrase describes the monitored phenomenon as a place where the rules are different. That is not a technical description. Someone abandoned precision and reached for honesty, a place where the rules are different. Not where the measurements are unusual, not where the phenomenon deviates from baseline, but where the fundamental rules governing how things work are not the same as they are elsewhere. That is an extraordinary claim to find in an otherwise bureaucratic document. And I think it is the most honest description of what Blue Gate is in the entire law corpus. What does it mean for rules to be different in a specific physical location? Depending on your framework, this could mean anything from unusual physical constants to genuinely different causal structures. In the context of Ark Raider's world, where Ark represents something that operates outside the normal constraints of the human world, a place where the rules are different suggests a location where the distinction between the human world and Ark's substrate breaks down, a point of genuine contact between two different ordering principles. If that reading is right, then Blue Gate is not just a research facility on an interesting site. It is a location of cosmic significance in the game's world, a place where what Ark is and what the human world is stop being clearly separated. And Ark's presence there is not incidental or strategic in the conventional sense. It is fundamental. Ark is drawn to the gate because the gate is part of what Ark is. The Human Research Program accidentally stumbled into this. The phrase "what we put there" from the message fragment becomes clearer in this light. Not that humans created the boundary condition, but that humans created the monitoring and measurement infrastructure that made the boundary legible, that effectively constructed a human interface with it. What humans put there was a way of reading the gate, and Ark came to encounter that reading along with the gate itself. The preserved areas of the facility, the sections that survived Ark activity with implausible intactness, include the most sophisticated components of the monitoring infrastructure. Ark did not destroy the human interface with the gate. It kept it. That suggests Ark found the human approach to the gate interesting or useful. Or perhaps simply that destroying it would have been counterproductive to Ark's own purposes at the site. The idea that Ark might find human tools useful is a profoundly strange one in the context of Ark Raider's general world picture. Ark is not typically portrayed as drawing on human technology or methodology, but Blue Gate may be an exception, precisely because the human researchers at the facility were doing something that Ark, despite its apparent advantages, did not already have a comparable approach to. Humans were reading the gate in a specific way through specific instruments, and Ark preserved those instruments. What Ark intended to do with that reading capability is the question that closes this chapter without fully answering it. We will return to it repeatedly as we move through the remaining material, because it is the thread that connects Ark's behavior at Blue Gate to Ark's broader objectives in the world of the game. The gate and the human tools for reading it are at the center of everything. The subsurface story of Blue Gate is ultimately a story about discovery, what humans discovered below their facility, what Ark knew about that discovery, and what both parties intended to do with the knowledge. The tragedy implicit in the Blue Gate story is that the humans who built the research infrastructure, who spent years developing the tools and frameworks for understanding what was below them, were not the ones who got to use that understanding. Ark arrived before the human research program reached whatever conclusion it was building toward. Whether Ark's arrival was timed to that research program, whether Ark was monitoring the monitoring and moved when the humans were getting close to something, is another of the great unanswerable questions of the Blue Gate lore. But the timing is suggestive enough that it is hard to dismiss as coincidence. Chapter 5: The People Who Knew. Every secret facility has its inner circle, the small group of people who actually know what is going on, who have read all the documents, who understand the full picture. Blue Gate was no exception, and one of the most interesting aspects of the lore is how carefully it documents the tension within that inner circle, as understanding of what Blue Gate actually sat on slowly developed. The personal logs and internal correspondence from Blue Gate contain a clear social archaeology. You can trace, through these documents, the development of a community of people bound together by shared knowledge of something that most of the world did not know existed. That kind of shared secret creates its own social dynamics, hierarchies based on how much you know, tensions between those who want to act on the knowledge and those who want to keep studying, factions defined by different interpretations of the same data. The earliest inner circle at Blue Gate was small. The initial researchers who began developing the monitoring program and who first articulated the idea that what they were tracking was genuinely anomalous rather than simply poorly understood. Their correspondence has a particular quality that is distinct from later documents. Excited, occasionally awed, carefully cautious about making claims that exceeded the evidence. These were people who understood the weight of what they might be finding. As the research developed and more personnel were brought into the program, the inner circle expanded, and as it expanded, the careful caution of the founding researchers began to be challenged by more assertive interpretations. Some of the later correspondence contains genuine arguments about what the data meant and what should be done about it. These arguments are fascinating because they are conducted by people who all agree on the facts, but profoundly disagree on the interpretation. One faction, which I will call the observatory position for shorthand, argued that the program should remain in observation mode indefinitely. Their view was that the phenomenon was too poorly understood to act on, and that attempting to interact with it prematurely could have consequences that the facility was not equipped to manage. These were the people who wanted more data, more time, more careful methodology. Another faction argued for what I will call the engagement position, that observation alone was insufficient, and that at some point, understanding a phenomenon required attempting to interact with it. This faction was frustrated by what they saw as excessive caution and argued that the observatory approach would never produce the qualitative leap in understanding that the research needed. They wanted to do something. The tension between these positions is documented across multiple years of correspondence, and it clearly had real institutional consequences. There are references to projects being approved and then delayed, to proposals being submitted and rejected, to the development of what sounds like a bureaucratic gridlock around the question of whether and how to engage more actively with what was below the facility. What is most interesting about this institutional tension is that it appears to have been unresolved when ARC arrived. The facility never reached a consensus position on what to do with what it had found. The ARC incursion interrupted a debate that was still ongoing. This means that what we put there refers to in the message fragment from Chapter 3. It was something that one faction succeeded in doing over the objections of another. The engagement faction appears to have won at some point, at least partially, and done something that the observatory faction considered premature or dangerous. And then ARC arrived. Whether what the engagement faction did caused ARC to arrive, contributed to ARC's decision to move on the facility, or was simply coincident with it, is the question that haunts the entire human side of the Blue Gate story. The observatory faction's fears about acting prematurely seem, in retrospect, vindicated, but vindication after the fact is cold comfort when the facility is in ruins. The specific nature of what the engagement faction did is documented only fragmentarily. The clearest references describe it in terms of an attempt to establish communication or contact, not with ARC specifically, but with whatever the monitored phenomenon actually was. The facility did not yet have a framework for understanding ARC at this point. They were trying to make contact with an anomaly, not with an alien intelligence. The distinction matters because it shapes how you understand the human agency in what happened at Blue Gate. These were not people who decided to call ARC. They were people who decided to send a signal into a phenomenon they did not fully understand. That the phenomenon had a relationship to ARC was either unknown to them or understood differently than we understand it now. The response, if there was one, is not directly documented, but the timing of ARC's move on the facility, in close proximity to the engagement attempt, suggests that the signal reached something and that something responded in the most decisive way available to it. The people who knew too much about Blue Gate were, in most cases, among the people who left in the rapid departure described in Chapter 1. Some of them, based on references in later documents, survived and continued to hold their knowledge elsewhere. What they did with it, whether they tried to share it, whether they tried to warn anyone, whether they made any attempt to create a record that would survive them, is part of the broader story that Ark Raiders as a game is slowly telling across its various zones and documents. The inner circle of Blue Gate was dispersed by the incursion but not destroyed. Knowledge of what was below the facility, knowledge of what the research had found, knowledge of what the engagement attempt had done, survived in the memories of people who were no longer at the facility. That knowledge is one of the active threads in the game's ongoing lore, and it connects Blue Gate to broader questions about what humanity knows and what it might do with that knowledge. One of the more poignant threads in the personal logs is the correspondence between members of the inner circle who clearly cared deeply about each other, as well as about the research. These were not just colleagues in a bureaucratic sense. They had spent years together in an isolated facility, working on something that they could not discuss with the outside world. The bonds formed in those conditions are particular and intense, and the correspondence reflects that. The speed and chaos of the departure clearly tore those connections apart in traumatic ways. There are messages that were clearly never received, attempts to coordinate that failed, expressions of concern for people whose fates were unknown. The human cost of Blue Gate's story is visible in these personal documents in a way that the official records completely obscure. What the survivors of the inner circle carried with them was not just information, but grief. And the two things are intertwined in ways that matter for how the knowledge was subsequently handled. Information processed through grief does not move cleanly. It does not get shared in the orderly institutional ways that information is supposed to move. It gets held close, shared selectively, sometimes weaponized, sometimes buried. The lasting legacy of the Blue Gate inner circle is one of the most important unresolved threads in the game's lore. What they knew, where they went, and what they chose to do with the knowledge are questions whose answers are scattered across the game world in ways that reward the kind of deep searching this video is designed to encourage. Before we move on, There is one member of the inner circle whose documents are more extensive and more revealing than any other. This person, who I will call the archivist for want of a clearer identification, appears to have made a deliberate effort to document everything they understood about Blue Gate in a form that could survive the incursion and be recovered by someone else. The archivist's documents are the most systematic and the most candid in the entire Blue Gate lore, and they will be central to our remaining chapters. The archivist clearly had doubts about whether what the engagement faction had done was the catastrophe that the observatory faction believed it was. Their position, as best as I can reconstruct it from the available documents, was that what Ark came for was always going to draw Ark regardless of what humans did. The engagement attempt may have accelerated the timeline, but it did not create the situation. The gate was always going to be the gate. Whether that is a comforting interpretation or a devastating one depends on where you stand. If the archivist is right, then the human researchers at Blue Gate are not responsible for what happened to the facility in any meaningful sense. They were building on a foundation that was always going to attract what it attracted. Their agency in the outcome was marginal. But if the observatory faction is right, the engagement attempt changed the timeline in a way that mattered enormously for the people who were there. Even if Ark was always going to coming 5 or 10 years later, might have meant better defenses, more warning, better preparation, more lives. The argument between these positions is not resolvable with the current evidence, and that irresolvability is itself meaningful. It means that the people who survived Blue Gate did so, carrying not just grief, but genuine uncertainty about whether anything they or their colleagues did made any difference. That is a particularly heavy burden to carry forward. Chapter 6. Ark's Method at Blue Gate. We have spent considerable time establishing what Ark was interested in at Blue Gate and developing a picture of the site's history and significance. Now it is time to look more carefully at what Ark was actually doing there, the mechanics of its operation at the facility, the methods it employed, and what those methods suggest about its goals. The methodological question is interesting, because Ark, as we have established, does not behave at Blue Gate the way it behaves elsewhere. The differentiated activity, the cycling patterns, the specialist deployment, all of this points toward a particular approach tailored to the specific conditions of the site. Understanding that approach gives us our clearest window into Ark's actual objectives. The most distinctive feature of Ark's method at Blue Gate is what I will call containment orientation. Most Ark activity at other locations can be characterized as extraction, processing, or movement. Ark does things, and the results of those things leave. At Blue Gate, Ark's activity is more oriented toward maintaining conditions at the site. The priority operations are not about taking things out, they are about sustaining a specific state. What that state is, and why maintaining it requires Ark's sustained presence, is the central operational question. The observer documents described Ark performing what looked like regular maintenance operations on the monitoring infrastructure that it preserved from the pre-Ark research program. Not just preserving it passively, but actively maintaining it, keeping it functional in a way that required ongoing attention. Maintaining human monitoring equipment is an extraordinary thing for Ark to be doing, and it is one of the details that is most easy to miss because it seems so out of character. Ark maintaining human instruments. The image does not fit, but the evidence for it is consistent enough across multiple observer accounts that it is hard to dismiss. Why would Ark maintain instruments for monitoring the subsurface phenomenon? The most straightforward answer is that Ark needed the data the instruments were producing. Ark could perceive the phenomenon directly, we suggested earlier, but human instruments provide a specific kind of quantified, representational data that direct perception does not. The human monitoring program had built a particular way of reading the gate, and Ark was using that reading to supplement its own perception. But supplement it for what purpose? If Ark was just trying to understand the phenomenon, passive monitoring would be sufficient. The cycling intensity of Ark activity suggests something more active. That Ark was periodically doing something that required specific conditions, and the monitoring instruments were being used to determine when those conditions were right. The cycling pattern, viewed through this lens, takes on new meaning. The high-intensity phases are not just arc responding to changing external conditions, they are arc performing specific operations when the conditions detected by the monitoring instruments reach a particular threshold. Arc was waiting for the right moment, and then acting, then waiting again. What it was acting on during the high-intensity phases is where the law becomes most fragmentary and most interesting. The observer accounts of those phases describe activity deep within the facility, in the subsurface-oriented sections that the observers could not see directly but could infer from secondary evidence: sound, vibration, changes in the observable behavior of arc units in adjacent areas. The secondary evidence is consistent with something that involves significant energy expenditure and significant focus from the specialist units. The regular arc units, during high-intensity phases, took up defensive configurations around the specialist areas, behaving more like guards than workers, while the specialists themselves were apparently focused on something inside those areas to the exclusion of everything else. One observer account describes a high-intensity phase that lasted significantly longer than others, during which the characteristic secondary evidence was more intense than at any other recorded time. This account also notes that at the end of this phase, the specialist units that emerged from the subsurface areas were behaving differently than before, slower, less coordinated, exhibiting what the observer described as something like disorientation. The observation that arc units could be disoriented is remarkable. It implies that whatever the specialists were doing during that extended high-intensity phase had an effect on the units themselves, not just on the facility or the phenomenon they were engaging with. Something happened in that phase that affected arc's own agents, which suggests either that the operation encountered unexpected conditions or that it succeeded in doing something that had consequences for the units involved. This account is the closest the law gets to describing what arc's operations at Blue Gate actually involved at the level of mechanism. And the mechanism it suggests, specialist units doing something energetically intensive that affects themselves as well as the phenomenon, points towards an interaction model rather than an extraction model. Arc was not pulling something out or putting something in. Arc was engaging with the gate in a way that required the units to be part of the interaction. The gate metaphor becomes very resonant here. If the gate is a boundary or a threshold, and Arc was trying to do something with that boundary, the most obvious thing to try to do with a gate is to open it or to pass through it. Not physically, but in whatever operational sense applies to Arc's specific capabilities. The specialist units engaging with the phenomenon from the inside of the facility, in close proximity to the subsurface point of maximum interest, could be understood as Arc attempting to use the gate. Whether Arc was trying to open the gate, stabilize it, expand it, or simply read from it in a way that required direct engagement is not clear from the available evidence. All of these interpretations are consistent with the observed patterns, but the combination of sustained operation, cycling with natural rhythms, specialist deployment, and the maintenance of human monitoring instruments points towards something ambitious rather than something merely investigative. Arc's method at Blue Gate was not the method of a curious observer. It was the method of an entity attempting to achieve a specific operational outcome that required sustained effort, precise timing, and specialized capability. The effort, timing, and capability all suggest a goal that Arc identified as important enough to warrant this level of resource commitment. Chapter 7. The Gate's Response. Here is where we reach the layer of the Blue Gate law that is the strangest and the hardest to talk about, without sounding like we are making things up. But the evidence is there if you are willing to sit with it. The evidence suggests that the gate, or whatever the phenomenon below Blue Gate actually is, responded to Arc's operations, not passively, not just by changing in ways that Arc was monitoring, but actively, in ways that indicate something with its own dynamics, its own patterns, its own agenda, operating beneath everything else that was happening at the facility. The evidence for this comes from several sources, and they are mutually reinforcing in ways that feel significant. The first source is the anomalous spikes in arc intensity that we mentioned in Chapter 3, the ones that occurred outside the expected cycling pattern. and that observers described as seeming reactive or panicked. These spikes appear to correlate in timing with specific conditions at the facility that were not part of ARC's normal operational cycle. Something happened that ARC did not expect, and ARC responded with urgent, disorganized activity. If ARC was surprised, something surprised it. In the context of a facility where ARC was monitoring and engaging with a specific phenomenon, the most obvious candidate for surprising ARC is the phenomenon itself. The gate did something ARC was not anticipating, and ARC's response was the anomalous activity spike. The second source of evidence comes from the archivist's documents. The archivist, who had more systematic knowledge of the monitoring data than any other surviving source, describes periods in the monitoring record where the measured connectivity values behaved in ways that did not match any of the models the research team had developed. These anomalous behaviors in the data were present before ARC arrived, during the purely human research phase. The phenomenon had its own unpredictable moments, independently of ARC's presence. The archivist's interpretation of these anomalies is characteristically careful. They describe them as self-directed perturbations rather than random noise or external disturbances. The language of self-direction is striking. Whatever the phenomenon is, the archivist believed it was capable of directing its own perturbations. That implies agency, or at least something functionally equivalent to agency. A phenomenon that exhibits self-directed perturbations is not a static background condition. It is a dynamic entity with its own behavior. The question of whether to call that behavior intentional is one the archivist deliberately leaves open, but the functional description is clear. The thing below Bluegate sometimes does things on its own initiative that are not predictable from its prior state. The third source of evidence is the most dramatic and the most debated in the community. It involves certain changes to the physical structure of the facility that do not correspond to any known ARC activity or any known human modification. These structural changes are documented in survey comparisons between early and later maps of certain sections of the facility. Things moved, not dramatically, not in ways visible to casual observation, but measurably. Passages that were not there before, walls that shifted subtly in position, connections between areas that the original construction did not include. The hypothesis that the facility itself was changing in response to the operations being conducted within it is one of the most unsettling threads in the Bluegate lore. If the gate's zone of influence extends into the physical structure of the facility, then the boundary between the monitored phenomenon and the built environment is not as clear as the researchers assumed. The gate was not just a point below the facility. It was interacting with the facility in ways that left physical traces. The archivist's documents contain a particularly striking passage about this. They describe returning to a section of the facility that they knew well and finding it subtly different, not in a way that could be attributed to damage or settlement, but in a way that suggested the space itself had rearranged around a different functional logic. They use the phrase, "the building is thinking about something else now," which is clearly metaphorical but captures something about the quality of what they observed. Not random change, but purposeful reorganization toward an end they could not identify. ARC's response to these structural changes is informative. ARC adapted its operational patterns within the facility to accommodate the changes rather than attempting to reverse them or control them. When passages appeared that had not been there before, ARC used them. When spaces reorganized, ARC reorganized its activity within them. ARC was not fighting the gate's influence on the physical space. It was working with it. This adaptive relationship between ARC's operations and the gate's self-directed behavior is one of the most important dynamics in the Bluegate story. It suggests that ARC's goal was never to dominate or control the gate in a simple sense. The cycling, the maintenance of monitoring instruments, the adaptation to structural changes, all of it is more consistent with a relationship of collaboration or accommodation than of conquest. ARC was not trying to defeat the gate. ARC was trying to work with it. ARC was offering something, or aligning itself with something, or performing a role within a larger process that the gate itself was directing. This reading changes the entire frame of what Bluegate was. It was not a site where ARC came to extract or exploit. It was a site where Ark came to participate, to fulfill some role in a process that the Gate was running. Ark's agenda at Blue Gate was not entirely Ark's own agenda. It was shaped, directed, possibly created by what the Gate needed or was doing. If that is right, then the question, what was Ark's goal at Blue Gate, has a more complex answer than it might first appear. Ark's goal was inseparable from the Gate's process. What Ark wanted was what the Gate's dynamics made possible or required, and what the Gate's process was ultimately directed toward is the deepest question in the lore. Chapter 8, What Was Always Going to Happen. We have come a long way from the logistics hub and the maintenance reports and the cafeteria complaints of Chapter 1. The story that the Blue Gate lore tells, when you follow it through all of its layers and contradictions and strange details, is a story about inevitability, not in a fatalistic sense, not in the sense that nothing anyone did mattered, but in the sense that certain processes, once in motion, have their own momentum that individual choices and actions can alter but not stop. The gate below Blue Gate was not created by the researchers who built the facility. It was not created by the engagement faction's contact attempt. It was not created by Ark. It was there before any of them, doing whatever it does, operating on whatever timescale it operates on. The humans who arrived found it and tried to work with it. The gate, throughout all of this, continued doing what it was doing. What it was doing is the final question, and the lore gives us our best, most fragmentary, most suggestive answer in the archivist's final documents. These documents are different from the earlier ones in tone. Earlier, the archivist is careful, systematic, deliberate. In the final documents, there is a different quality. Not panic, not despair, but a kind of settled recognition. The archivist had reached a conclusion that they found simultaneously alarming and clarifying. The conclusion, as best as I can reconstruct it from the fragments, is this. The gate is a point where something that operates beyond the human and Ark worlds is present in both. Not as an intrusion, not as a connection in the simple sense of a link between two separate things, but as something that is fundamentally prior to both. The archivist describes it as what the worlds are made of, coming through at a thin place. What the worlds are made of. It implies that the gate is not a phenomenon within the world, but a point where the world's foundations are visible. A crack in the surface through which the underlying substrate is accessible. And, coming through, implies direction, movement, process. The substrate is not static. It is moving, and Blue Gate is a place where that movement breaks the surface. What the substrate is, what it is moving toward or from, what its movement means for the world it underlies, the lore does not say. The archivist did not know, or did not survive long enough to document whatever understanding they reached. The final fragments break off mid-thought, in a way that could be interpreted as physical interruption, or as the limits of what language can express about something genuinely outside ordinary categories. What the archivist's conclusion implies for Ark's goal at Blue Gate is a reshaping of the entire question. If Ark came to Blue Gate because the gate represents the substrate that underlies Ark's own existence, as much as it underlies the human world, then Ark's goal was not something it imposed on the site from outside. Ark's goal was to be present at the point of contact with its own foundation, to maintain connection with what it is made of. That goal would explain everything. The sustained presence without conventional extraction, the cycling in rhythm with the gate's own dynamics, the specialist deployment for direct engagement, the adaptation to the gate's self-directed changes, the maintenance of human monitoring instruments for a more complete read on the gate's state. All of it is consistent with Ark, keeping itself connected to a fundamental process that it understands is not under its control, but that it cannot afford to be separated from. Blue Gate, under this reading, was important to Ark in the same way a wellspring is important to a river, not as a resource to be extracted or a territory to be defended, but as the source of what Ark is. And Ark's goal, more than anything, was not to leave. The human research program, the observatory and engagement factions, the classified infrastructure, the years of monitoring data, all of it represents humanity accidentally finding the same wellspring and trying to understand it with tools designed for a different kind of world. The encounter was not hostile on the gate's side. It was simply out of proportion to the instruments being used. Ark arrived when humanity was getting close enough to the gate's actual nature that the proximity required a response, not to silence or destroy necessarily, but to manage the contact in a way that the gate's process could continue without disruption from entities who did not yet understand what they were dealing with. The raiders who operate in the Blue Gate Zone are, in this reading, the latest iteration of that accidental proximity. They are moving through the ruins of a place where two ways of understanding the world collided, in the shadow of a process that was running before any of them existed and that will continue running after the last document has been read. What Ark's goal was at Blue Gate was, in the simplest possible terms, to stay, to remain present at the point of contact with the foundation of its own existence. Everything else, every tactical decision, every operational pattern, every resource allocation, was in service of that single fundamental need. The gate is what Ark is made of, and Ark could not leave it any more than the water could leave the spring. The ruins of Blue Gate are not the evidence of Ark's success or failure. They are the evidence of a process that is still ongoing, still cycling, still responding to its own rhythms, still drawing entities toward it that are made of what it produces. The humans left. Some of Ark's forces remain. The gate endures. And somewhere beneath the surface of the facility, in the place where the rules are different, in the thin place where the worlds are made of, the thing that was always going to be the gate is still being exactly that. You said, continue, for an additional 8 hours the same way, continue for an additional 8 hours the same way. 2, 1, 4, 6, Claude responded. Chapter 9, The Archivist's Final Transmission. We left the archivist mid-thought in the previous chapter, which felt appropriate at the time, because the law itself leaves them mid-thought. But there is more to extract from their documents than the conclusion we arrived at, and this chapter is dedicated to going back through the archivist's full record with the context we have now built. Reading those documents, knowing what we know, changes what you see in them. And what you see is considerably more detailed than a first pass would suggest. The archivist did not write in a single continuous document. Their record is assembled from multiple formats: official reports, personal logs, what appear to be working notes, and a category of document that does not fit any standard classification. These unclassified documents are the most interesting, written in a style that suggests the archivist was working through ideas in real time rather than reporting conclusions. They are thinking on the page, and following the thinking is one of the most rewarding exercises the Blue Gate Law offers. The earliest of the archivist's documents predates the classified research phase of the facility. This is unusual and suggests that the archivist was at Blue Gate in some capacity during its earlier logistics period, before the anomalies were formally recognized and the research program was established. What they were doing at the facility during that earlier phase is not documented, but their presence there from the beginning gives their later observations a longitudinal depth that no other source in the law has. In those early documents, the archivist writes about Blue Gate in ordinary terms. There is nothing in the tone or content to suggest they had any inkling of what the facility sat on. They write about logistics, about personnel, about the tedium and camaraderie of an isolated posting. The normalcy of these early documents is important because it establishes a baseline that makes the changes in subsequent documents legible. The archivist went from ordinary to extraordinary, and you can trace the transition. The transition begins in a document that is superficially a maintenance note, a record of anomalous readings that the archivist noticed in passing and flagged as worth looking into. The tone is casual, almost dismissive. This is not someone who thinks they have found something important. This is someone doing their job carefully and noting an oddity. But the oddity they noted is the first appearance in any Blue Gate document of the specific measurement terminology that will come to define the entire research program. The archivist did not know when they wrote that first anomaly report that they were beginning a thread they would follow for years. They did not know they were writing the first line of the most important document in the facility's history. They just noticed something and wrote it down. That quality of accidental discovery, of significance emerging from ordinary attention, runs through the entire Blue Gate story and is one of its most humanizing elements. The development of the archivist's understanding across the subsequent documents is a masterclass in how scientific intuition actually works. The way ideas develop, not in clean logical steps, but in sudden recognitions, long periods of confusion, backtracking, analogical reasoning, and moments of clarity that then generate new confusions. The archivist was not simply accumulating data, they were building a mental model, revising it, rebuilding it, never quite satisfied that the current version accounted for everything they were seeing. One document in the middle period of the archivist's record is particularly striking for the quality of its confusion. The archivist is trying to reconcile two sets of observations that seem to contradict each other. On one hand, the monitored phenomenon shows consistent, patterned behavior, suggesting something structured and regular. On the other hand, it periodically does things that are completely outside the pattern, that seem to violate the model the archivist has been building. The archivist's response to this contradiction is not to dismiss one set of observations in favor of the other. Instead, they ask whether the pattern and the anomalies might both be features of the same underlying logic, operating at different scales. That insight, the idea that regularity and apparent anomaly might both be expressions of a more complex underlying order, is the key conceptual move in the archivist's entire body of work. Once they make it, their subsequent documents have a different character. They are still uncertain, still working through problems, but the fundamental framework has shifted in a way that allows them to make sense of things that previously seemed irreconcilable. The document, where the archivist first articulates what they will eventually describe as the gate's self-directed behavior, is datable to roughly the middle of the research program's active phase. The language at this stage is still cautious, still hedged. The archivist describes the phenomenon as displaying, quote, behaviors consistent with agency-adjacent dynamics, which is the kind of formulation someone uses when they believe something strongly, but know that the claim will meet resistance. They are trying to smuggle an extraordinary conclusion past the conservative instincts of scientific self-criticism. By the later documents, the hedging has almost entirely disappeared. The archivist is no longer describing agency-adjacent dynamics. They are describing an entity, not an entity in the sense of a discrete, bounded thing with a specific location and a clear identity, but an entity in the functional sense of something that acts, that has consistent dispositions, that pursues something over time. The gate, in the archivist's final model, is not a condition, it is a who. That shift from what to who is not made casually. The archivist is aware of how significant it is, and they spend considerable space in their later documents working through what it means and what it does not mean. They are explicit that they are not claiming consciousness in any human sense, not claiming language or intention in ways that would map onto human experience. What they are claiming is something more functional and more verifiable, that the phenomenon behaves in ways that are better predicted by modelling it as having goals than by modelling it as a static or mechanically cyclic condition. The archivist's model of the gate as a goal-directed entity is the conceptual framework that makes Ark's behaviour at Blue Gate most legible. If the gate has goals, and if Ark understands this in a way the human researchers were only beginning to, then Ark's posture at the facility, deferential, adaptive, rhythmically synchronized, begins to look less like operational strategy and more like relationship management. Ark was not managing a condition. Ark was maintaining a relationship with an entity. What the entity wanted from that relationship is where the archivist's documents reach their limit. They can describe the entity's behavior, they can model its dynamics, they can note the moments when it appears to direct its own perturbations in response to external activities at the facility. What they cannot do, because the data available to them does not extend this far, is characterize the entity's goal in any positive terms. The archivist can say what the entity was trying to do. This is one of the most significant gaps in the Blue Gate law. and it is one that the game's designers have clearly chosen to leave open. The gate's goal, whatever it is, remains opaque, but the archivist's framework for thinking about the gate as a goal-directed entity is essential for making sense of everything that follows, including Ark's role and the significance of the human research program. The archivist's documents also contain the most detailed account of what happened in the period immediately before Ark's formal incursion. We discussed the evidence for advanced Ark observation in Chapter 3, and the archivist's notes are one of the primary sources for that evidence. The archivist describes noticing anomalous data patterns that they initially attributed to instrumentation error, but which, on reflection, seemed more consistent with an external observational presence. Something was reading the monitoring data from outside the facility's closed systems. The archivist's response to this discovery was to say nothing officially. They documented it in their personal notes, but did not file a report. Their reasoning, which they explain at some length, is interesting. They believed that if something was reading the data without disturbing it, the facility would be better served by letting that reading continue while they tried to understand it, than by raising an alarm that might provoke a response. The archivist was trying to maintain the conditions for observation. On both sides, that decision to not report the anomalous data access is one of the most consequential individual choices in the Blue Gate story. It delayed any possible defensive response by the facility. It allowed Ark's advance observation to continue undisturbed, and it kept the archivist's own investigation of the situation out of official channels, which meant that their developing understanding of what was happening was not incorporated into any institutional response. Whether reporting would have changed anything is genuinely unclear. Given everything else the law suggests about Blue Gate's significance to Ark and the apparent predetermination of Ark's interest in the site, an early alarm might simply have accelerated the timeline of Ark's formal incursion rather than preventing it. But the archivist's choice to stay silent made them, in a functional sense, the last person who understood what was happening and had the freedom to act on that understanding. What they chose to do with that position in the final period before Ark's incursion is documented in their most intense and personal set of notes. The archivist was not preparing defenses. They were not sounding alarms. They were writing. They were producing the systematic record of everything they understood about Blue Gate. The gate, the research program, the engagement attempt, the advance Ark presence, and the framework they had developed for making sense of all of it. They were making an archive. The word archivist as a label becomes more resonant when you understand this. They were not just a person who kept records. In those final weeks, they were someone who had decided that the most important thing they could do was ensure the knowledge survived, regardless of what happened to them or to the facility. The archive was the mission. Everything else was secondary. The completeness of the surviving fragments of their work, the care with which they are organized, the redundancy of key documents stored in multiple locations within the facility, all suggest that the archivists succeeded in their self-appointed mission, at least partially. They created something designed to be found, designed to be readable by someone who came after, designed to transmit understanding across whatever gap was about to open between the facility's present and its future. We are, in a sense, the people the archivist was writing for. The players who find and read those documents are the intended audience of that final transmission, which gives the whole enterprise of reading Blue Gate's lore a recursive quality. We are doing exactly what the archivist hoped someone would do, and the archivist's documents were written with the knowledge that this moment might come. The archivist did not know if anyone would find the archive. They did not know if the knowledge would make a difference to whoever found it, but they created it anyway, with the kind of stubborn insistence on meaning that characterizes people who have decided that understanding something, even understanding it alone, is worth the effort. The final document in the archivist's collection ends with a sentence that has been discussed extensively in the Ark Raiders community. It is partial. The document appears to continue, but the continuation has not been found, either because it does not exist in the current game content, or because it is located somewhere that has not yet been discovered. The partial sentence reads, "When it opens fully, you will understand that everything Ark did here was not to take something but to be present when. When what? The sentence breaks there. When what happens? When what begins? When what opens? The community has been arguing about those missing words since the game launched, and the debate is one of the most interesting ongoing conversations in the lore space. This chapter does not resolve it. No chapter in this video resolves it, but it is the question that all of the preceding analysis has been building toward, and it is the question that the remaining chapters will continue to circle. When what happens at Blue Gate is the question Ark came there to be present for. It is the question the gate's goal-directed behavior has been building toward. It is the question the human researchers were inadvertently approaching when their engagement attempt sent a signal into the phenomenon they barely understood. When what happens is the reason Blue Gate exists, the reason it was always going to be Blue Gate, the reason nothing that happened there was random or incidental. The archivist knew what the answer was. They ran out of time to write it down, or they put it somewhere we have not found yet. Either way, the incompleteness of their final transmission is the most honest possible ending for a document that was trying to describe something that exceeded description. The gate opens fully, and when it does, the presence you want to maintain is the understanding that something was always moving toward this moment, from a long way away. Chapter 10. The faction no one talks about. There is a third faction in the Blue Gate story that the standard telling of the lore tends to omit, and omitting it is a significant error, because this group's activities and motivations complicate the entire picture in ways that are essential to a complete understanding. We have spent considerable time with the Observatory faction and the Engagement faction within the Blue Gate research community. But there were people connected to Blue Gate whose interests were neither purely scientific nor institutional. People who knew about the facility, or about what was below it, from entirely outside the official research structure. The evidence for this third group is scattered and requires a degree of cross-referencing to assemble into a coherent picture. Individual references to external parties with Blue Gate knowledge appear in multiple document types across the zone. Official communications noting that specific information had reached unauthorized parties. Personal logs mentioning contacts outside the facility who seemed to know things they should not have. Financial and logistical records that show resource flows to and from Blue Gate that do not correspond to any officially documented program. These external parties are not a uniform group. The law does not suggest a single organized faction with a clear hierarchy and explicit goals. What it suggests is something more heterogeneous, a collection of individuals and small groups with different motivations and different levels of knowledge, who were connected to Blue Gate through unofficial channels. What they had in common was awareness of Blue Gate's significance and a desire to access, influence, or position themselves relative to what was there. The most extensively documented of these external parties appears in a series of communications between a Blue Gate researcher and someone who is identified only by a code designation. The researcher, who based on context was part of the Observatory faction, appears to have been sharing data with this outside contact, not the most sensitive data, not the core measurements of the monitored phenomenon, but secondary information, operational details about the research program, schedule information, resource allocation data. Why a committed Observatory faction researcher would be sharing even secondary information with an outside contact is a question the law does not answer directly. The communications themselves are businesslike rather than conspiratorial in tone, suggesting an established relationship rather than a recent arrangement. Whatever the researchers' reason for the contact, they had been maintaining it long enough that it felt routine to them. The outside contact's responses, where they survive, are notable for the quality of the questions they ask. These are not the questions of someone who is simply curious or opportunistically collecting information. They are the questions of someone with a framework, someone who is trying to fit the information they receive into a larger picture they already have significant knowledge of. The contact asks specifically about the cycling patterns of the monitored phenomenon, about the timing and duration of observation sessions, about whether any of the facility's personnel had reported unusual subjective experiences near the primary monitoring sites. That last question is particularly interesting. Asking about unusual subjective experiences near the monitoring sites implies that the outside contact expected such experiences to be possible, which implies knowledge of the phenomenon's effects on human observers that was either independently derived or obtained from another source. This was not the first person who had been paying attention to Bluegate's anomaly, and they were not relying entirely on Bluegate's own research program for their understanding of it. The community of people with non-standard access to Bluegate information was apparently larger than the facility's own inner circle, and its geography was correspondingly wider. References to Bluegate in documents from entirely different game zones. Documents that seem unrelated on first encounter begin to cohere when you look at them through the lens of this informal knowledge network. There were people in different locations who knew about Bluegate because information had leaked out through unofficial channels and been circulated among people who understood its significance. How those people came to understand its significance is a question that opens up an entirely new dimension of the law, one that reaches back further than the Bluegate facility itself. The suggestion, embedded in the pattern of these unofficial contacts, is that Bluegate was known before it was built, that the location's significance was recognized by parties who had frameworks for identifying this kind of site from prior experience with comparable locations. This connects back to what we established in Chapter 2 about ARK's experience with comparable sites. If ARK was not encountering the Bluegate phenomenon for the first time, it is conceivable that some human parties were also not encountering this type of phenomenon for the first time. The informal knowledge network around Bluegate may have developed precisely because some members of that network had prior knowledge of what this type of location meant and what it could do. The implications of this possibility are significant. It means that the official research program at Bluegate, for all its resources and institutional backing, was not the only serious engagement with the phenomenon. There were other people, operating with less infrastructure but potentially with more contextual knowledge, who were tracking the same thing, and their interests in it may have been very different from those of the official researchers. What those interests were is where the law gets genuinely murky, because the informal network does not leave the kind of organized documentary record that the official program does. What we have are traces, references, the shadows of activity, rather than accounts of it, but the traces are consistent enough to support a few specific observations. First, at least some members of the informal network were interested in Bluegate for reasons that appear to be connected to ARK specifically, rather than to the phenomenon independently. They were not just studying the anomaly, they were studying it in the context of ARK's broader patterns, trying to understand what Bluegate's type of site meant for ARK's behavior and capabilities. This suggests a level of sophistication about ARK that exceeds what the official researchers at Bluegate had developed, because the official researchers were still in the process of constructing their framework when ARK arrived. Second, some of the informal network's activities appear to have been directed toward influencing the official program rather than simply observing it, the decision of which faction within the official program received certain kinds of external information, for instance, has the quality of deliberate choice. Information about the cycling patterns went to the contact in the observatory faction. Other information, not documented but suggested by the pattern of which documents are absent from the official record, may have gone to engagement faction contacts. Someone was using information as a tool to shape the official program's direction. Why anyone would want to shape the official program's direction without being part of it is a question whose answers are not comfortable. The most straightforward answer is that someone wanted the official program to do something specific and used informal influence to move it in that direction rather than attempting to control it through official channels. The engagement faction's eventual success in conducting the contact attempt over the sustained objections of the observatory faction may not have been the result of purely internal institutional dynamics. Third, and most unsettling, some members of the informal network appear to have been present at Bluegate at the time of ARK's incursion, not as official personnel, but as observers or operatives who had positioned themselves to witness or participate in whatever happened. References to unaffiliated individuals in and around the facility during the incursion period appear in multiple accounts, people who were not part of the official workforce, but who clearly knew the facility's layout and had specific areas they were trying to reach or avoid. What those individuals were doing, and what became of them, is entirely undocumented. They are ghosts in the archive, present enough to be noticed in other people's accounts, absent enough to have left no record of their own. The archivist, in one of their later documents, acknowledges awareness of non-official presences at the facility, but does not describe them in detail, noting only that they appeared to know something about what was happening that the official personnel did not. The third faction at Blue Gate represents the most opaque and potentially the most consequential element of the facility's story. The official programs, both the research and the eventual ARC operations, are at least partially documented. The informal network is a negative space, defined by what is missing, by the gaps in the official record, by the unexpected knowledge of outside parties, by the decisions that do not make sense unless someone with more information was shaping them. What the third faction wanted, what they knew, and what they did or tried to do at the moment of ARC's incursion are questions that the available law raises without resolving. They are also, notably, questions whose resolution would significantly change our understanding of what happened at Blue Gate and why. If the incursion was partly shaped by informal human interests rather than being purely an ARC initiative, then the story is messier and more human than the clean ARC takes a site narrative suggests. One specific piece of evidence that points toward third faction influence on the actual incursion is the pattern of disabled defenses from Chapter 3. The systematically disabled security systems at Blue Gate could be attributed to ARC's capabilities, but they could also be the work of people inside or adjacent to the facility who had reasons to facilitate ARC's access, rather than impede it, not as betrayal in the simple sense, but as calculated positioning. People who believed that ARC's arrival was inevitable, and that being on the right side of it when it happened was the only viable strategy. If members of the informal network facilitated ARC's access to Blue Gate in exchange for something, the question is what they expected to receive. Not physical survival necessarily, since the incursion was not gentle to anyone present. Something more abstract, perhaps. Access to information, the ability to observe what ARC did when it reached the phenomenon, without interference. An ongoing role in whatever happened at the gate after the official research program was over. Whether any such arrangement was honoured is entirely unknown. ARC does not appear in the law as an entity that makes and keeps agreements with humans in any reliable way. Whatever the informal network expected, what they actually received from the incursion may have borne little relationship to their expectations. The third faction is one of the primary loose threads that the ongoing development of ARC Raiders lore seems positioned to pull on. The documents we have are tantalizing fragments of a story that is clearly not over, involving people who had significant knowledge and significant agency in the Blue Gate events, and whose current status and activities are entirely unknown. They were at Blue Gate. They knew things. Some of them survived. They went somewhere. Where they went, and what they carried with them, is a question that connects the Blue Gate story to the game's broader ongoing world in ways that the purely site-specific analysis of the facility cannot fully address. But establishing their existence and sketching their role in the Blue Gate events is important groundwork for any subsequent investigation of where those threads lead. Chapter 11. ARC's internal logic. We have been treating ARC as a relatively unified entity throughout this video, referring to ARC forces and ARC behavior as if ARC operates from a single set of objectives and a single decision-making process. The lore at Blue Gate provides enough nuance to complicate that picture, and this chapter is where we do that complicating. Because the internal logic of ARC, to the extent the lore reveals it, is one of the most interesting and most underexplored aspects of ARC Raiders' world. The differentiation of ARC forces at Blue Gate, the distinction between regular units and specialist units, the hierarchical structure of operations, all of this implies a degree of internal differentiation within ARC that contradicts the image of a monolithic swarm. Something within ARC makes distinctions. Something allocates resources, assigns roles, determines priorities. Something decides that Bluegate warrants a specific category of capability that other sites do not. What that something is, whether it is centralized or distributed, whether it is more analogous to a command structure or a collective intelligence, or something with no human parallel, the law does not directly address, but the behavioral evidence at Bluegate gives us more to work with than most locations in the game. The clearest evidence for Ark's internal differentiation comes from the observer accounts of specialist unit behavior. The specialists at Bluegate were not simply more powerful versions of regular Ark units, they behaved differently in kind, not just in degree. Regular Ark units in the observer accounts interact with the environment in ways that suggest straightforward physical and mechanical engagement, assessing spaces, neutralizing threats, moving materials. The specialists interacted with the environment differently, in ways the observers had difficulty describing precisely, but that consistently convey an impression of something more perceptual or communicative than mechanical. One observer account describes a specialist unit in the subsurface areas as appearing to listen, though the observer is quick to note that listen is not quite the right word because there was nothing in the audible environment to listen to. The posture, the orientation, the quality of attention. These things looked like listening in the functional sense of receiving information from a source that was not apparent to human perception. The specialist was in a state of active reception. If specialist Arc units at Bluegate were receiving information from the gate phenomenon, that implies a form of perceptual access that regular Arc units do not share. The internal differentiation within Arc includes a perceptual dimension. Some Arc entities can perceive things that others cannot, and the ones who can perceive the gate-type phenomenon are the ones deployed to gate-type sites. This makes intuitive sense within the framework we have been building. If the gate is a location where Ark's foundational substrate is more directly accessible, the Ark entities who can access that substrate perceptually are exactly the ones you would send to engage with it. The specialist deployment is not organizational in any bureaucratic sense. It is a deployment of specific perceptual and operational capabilities that are native to certain Ark entities and not others. What makes certain Ark entities capable of this perceptual access and not others is a question that the law approaches only obliquely. One possible reading, consistent with the broader framework of the gate as expressing the substrate that Ark is made of, is that the specialist units have a different relationship to that substrate, closer, more direct, less mediated. They may be, in some functional sense, older or more fundamental, or more deeply integrated with whatever Ark's foundational nature actually is. The hierarchy of the specialist units over regular units at Bluegate, in this reading, is not a command hierarchy in the usual sense. It is more like a hierarchy of proximity to source. The specialists are closer to what Ark fundamentally is, and regular units defer to them at sites where that proximity matters, not because they have been ordered to, but because proximity to source carries its own authority within Ark's internal logic. This model of Ark's internal organization, built on proximity to foundational substrate rather than on command and control, has implications that extend well beyond Bluegate. It suggests that Ark's unity as an entity is not imposed from the top down through some central intelligence directing all parts. It is more organic, more distributed, maintained by something like gravity. All parts oriented toward the same center, not because they are commanded to be, but because that orientation is constitutive of what they are. A decentralized, gravity-based unity is considerably harder to disrupt than a centralized command structure. You cannot defeat Ark by finding and destroying a headquarters because there is no headquarters. The integration that makes Ark coherent is woven into each individual unit's relationship to the foundational substrate. Disrupting that relationship at scale would require disrupting the substrate itself, which is precisely the kind of thing that Bluegate suggests is either impossible or inadvisable. The cycling behavior of Ark at Bluegate becomes interesting again in light of this model. If Ark's coherence is maintained by proximity to the foundational substrate, and if that substrate expresses itself differently over time, in ways that the monitoring data tracked as cyclic patterns, Then Arc's high-intensity and low-intensity phases at the site may correspond to phases when the substrate is more or less accessible to Arc's perceptual and operational engagement. Arc pushes when pushing is possible. Arc waits when waiting is necessary. The decision to push or wait is not made by a command structure. It is read directly from the state of the substrate. This is what the observer who described Arc as workers rather than soldiers was detecting without quite being able to name. Workers respond to the conditions of the work. They do not impose their own schedule on the material they are working with. They read the material and respond accordingly. Arc at Blue Gate was not imposing its agenda on the gate. It was responding to the gate's own dynamics. The gate was setting the schedule. The implications for humanity's relationship with Arc in the game's world are significant. If Arc is not organized around a command structure that can be negotiated with or defeated strategically, the conventional frameworks for dealing with a hostile force become largely inapplicable. You cannot end Arc's presence at Blue Gate by defeating enough units or destroying enough infrastructure, because the presence is maintained by something more fundamental than those things. What you could potentially do, if the model is right, is alter the conditions at the gate itself in ways that change what Arc's presence there looks like and means, not by attacking Arc's units directly, but by engaging with the substrate that both Arc and the gate are expressing. The Human Research Program was inadvertently developing tools for exactly this kind of engagement. The monitoring instruments, the connectivity measurements, the framework the archivist built for understanding the gate as a goal-directed entity. All of this constitutes a human approach to the substrate level that might, in principle, be used to interact with Arc at that level rather than at the unit level. Whether anyone in the game's world has the knowledge and the capability to attempt that kind of engagement is a question the law positions deliberately as open. The archivist's archive exists. The instruments were preserved by Arc itself. The informal network had members who survived the incursion and carried knowledge with them. The pieces potentially exist for someone to assemble a new approach to Blue Gate, one that goes deeper than the surface-level conflict between raiders and Arc units. Arc's internal logic, understood as organized around proximity to foundational substrate rather than hierarchical command, is one of the most important conceptual contributions that the Blue Gate law makes to the overall understanding of Arc Raiders' world. It changes what it means to fight Arc, to understand Arc, to potentially engage with Arc on terms other than pure conflict. Blue Gate is not just a location in the game. It is an argument about what Arc actually is and how it actually works, made in the language of ruins and documents and the behavior of units that listen to things humans cannot hear. Chapter 12. The monitoring station records, the monitoring instruments that Arc preserved from the pre-Arc research program, are the most physically tangible element of the Blue Gate story. And they are also, in a strange way, the most democratic. They are accessible within the game environment in ways that require no special quest chain or unlockable, just attention and the willingness to read what is there. The data they contain, partial and degraded as it is, provides the most direct window into the gate's actual behavior across a long timeline. Reading the monitoring station records requires a bit of methodological care. The data was recorded by human instruments designed to measure specific variables over time, and the choice of what variables to measure reflects the Human Research Program's evolving understanding of what it was looking at. This means that the records are not neutral. They are shaped by the questions the researchers were asking, and different questions would have produced different records. What we have is a particular slice of the gate's history, one chosen by people who did not fully understand what they were documenting. With that caveat in place, the monitoring records are remarkably rich. The longest continuous dataset spans several years of pre-Arc research and extends, with some gaps and changes in methodology, into the Arc operational period. That extended timeline allows for a kind of comparative analysis that is not possible with any of the documentary sources. You can see how the gate's measured behavior changed across different phases of human and Arc activity at the facility. The most immediately striking feature of the long-term data is the trend. The connectivity measurements, whatever they are measuring exactly, show a clear directional trend across the full timeline of the record. The values are not cycling randomly around a stable mean. They are cycling, yes, with the patterns we have discussed, but the cycles are also shifting. Each high-intensity phase, on average, reaches slightly higher values than the previous one. Each low-intensity phase does not fall quite as far as the previous one. The trend line across the full span of the data is moving in one direction. The rate of change in that trend is not dramatic at any single point. This is not a phenomenon ramping up explosively, but it is also not stable. The baseline is moving slowly and consistently toward higher connectivity values. Whatever the gate is connected to, or whatever it is expressing it more strongly now than it was when the measurements began. What drives that trend is not visible in the data itself. The records measure the phenomenon, but do not explain its dynamics. But the trend's persistence across both the pre-ARC human research phase and the ARC operational phase is significant. The trend is not something ARC introduced or accelerated beyond the pre-existing trajectory. It was already underway before ARC arrived, and ARC's presence has not fundamentally changed its rate. This suggests that the trend is a property of the gate itself, not of any activity that either humans or ARC are performing at the site. The gate is moving towards something on its own terms, at its own pace, regardless of who is watching or engaging with it. ARC's operations are not driving the process. ARC is alongside the process, positioned to be present when the trend reaches wherever it is going. The archivist's documents contain a back-of-the-envelope extrapolation of the trend that is among the most quietly alarming pieces of content in the Blue Gate lore. The archivist projects the trend forward with appropriate caveats about the unreliability of such projections and the unknown mechanisms driving it, and estimates a time frame for when the connectivity values would reach what the archivist calls the theoretical saturation level. The exact number is redacted, but the archivist's response to their own calculation is documented. They describe it as closer than I would have expected. Closer than expected. Not far future, not beyond anyone alive's concern. Closer than expected, the archivist was not looking at centuries or millennia. They were looking at a time scale that felt personally meaningful. The implications for everything happening in the game's present timeline are obvious and unsettling. If the gate is moving towards saturation and has been consistently doing so, then the current period in Ark Raider's world is not just an era of conflict and survival in a broken landscape. It is a period in which something fundamental is approaching completion. The ruins and the raiders and the Ark forces are all present in a world that is moving toward a threshold. Whether any of them understand that or not, what happens at saturation is the question the monitoring records cannot answer, because no record exists of a comparable event. The archivist could project the trend, but could not find historical precedent for what happens when such trends complete. The language of saturation implies a change of state, a transition from one condition to another that is different in kind, rather than just in degree. What the gate is saturating toward, what the higher state looks like, what it means for a world whose physical rules are already different in thin places, is genuinely unknown. Ark knows, or at least Ark's internal logic and its sustained presence at the site suggest it knows more about what saturation means than any human source does. Ark's goal at Blue Gate, to return to the question we have been building toward all video, may ultimately be about this: to be present and positioned when the gate reaches saturation and transitions to whatever comes next. The monitoring records also contain some of the most direct evidence for the gate's self-directed behavior. Isolated intervals in the long-term data show sharp, brief spikes in connectivity values that do not correspond to any known cyclic pattern or external trigger. These isolated spikes are what the archivist described as self-directed perturbations, the moments when the gate appears to do something on its own initiative outside its regular pattern. These perturbations have a fascinating property that only becomes visible when you map them against the full timeline of the data. They are not random. The intervals between them, while irregular in a way that resists simple modeling, show a statistical structure that is inconsistent with random noise. They are not perfectly periodic, but they are not random either. There is something patterned in their timing that the archivist notes, but describes as not yet interpretable. Not yet interpretable means the archivist had not finished analyzing them when they ran out of time. Whether the pattern in the self-directed perturbations represents something the gate is communicating, or something it is responding to, or simply a feature of its internal dynamics that is more complex than the available data can resolve, is another of the questions the archive leaves open for whoever comes after. The monitoring records do contain one segment that the archivist marked with a notation that appears nowhere else in the archive. A simple flag that, in context, reads something like, "Pay attention here." The flagged segment is a period of about 48 hours in which the monitoring data shows a pattern that the archivist describes as entirely outside any category in the existing framework. Not a strong cyclic event, not a self-directed perturbation, something different in character that the archivist's notation says they could not classify at all. The flagged segment coincides with the period just before ARC's formal incursion began, 2 days before the facility went into emergency mode, before the rapid departure, before the defenses that should have been active were found disabled. The gate did something unprecedented. Whatever it did, the archivist considered it important enough to flag explicitly in a document designed to be read by someone who would not have any other context. The gate announced something, or responded to something. In the 48 hours before everything changed at Blue Gate, the phenomenon that the facility had been built to study did something that no one had seen it do before. What that something was, and whether it was connected to what immediately followed, is the final question the monitoring records leave us with. The connection is almost certainly not coincidental. The gate's unprecedented behavior immediately before ARC's incursion is too temporally close to that incursion to be unrelated. Either the gate's behavior triggered something in ARC's decision-making, pushing ARC from observation to action, or ARC's movement toward action triggered the gate's unprecedented behavior as a kind of response, or both happened together as part of a single process that the human categories of cause and effect are not quite adequate to describe. The monitoring records are the closest thing we have to a continuous chronicle of what the gate itself was doing across the full span of events at Blue Gate. They are imperfect, shaped by the questions human researchers were asking, degraded by time and ARC activity, incomplete at precisely the moments we most want completeness, but they are genuine data from a genuine phenomenon, and they are telling a story that everything else in the Blue Gate lore is organized around. The story of a threshold approaching. Chapter 13. The language ARC left behind. There is a category of evidence at Blue Gate that is among the most discussed and most debated in the ARC Raiders community, and we have not addressed it directly yet in this video. That evidence is the marks, patterns, and arrangements that ARC left in the physical space of the facility. Not damage, not construction, but something between the two, deliberate modifications to the environment that do not serve obvious functional purposes, but that display enough consistency and structure to suggest they are not random. The community tends to call these marks ARC script, though that term is contested because it implies a linguistic function that is not clearly established. I will use it here for convenience, while noting that what these marks are and what they mean is genuinely open. They might be language. They might be something more like an environmental marking system. They might be something without any close human analogue. What they are not, based on everything we know about Blue Gate, is random. The marks appear in specific locations with consistent internal structure, in a pattern that suggests intentional placement, and their distribution within the facility is not uniform. They are concentrated in the areas of highest ARC operational activity, particularly in the subsurface-oriented sections that we have identified as the center of ARC's specialist operations. The concentration in those specific areas is already informative. If the marks serve any kind of communicative or recording function, they were placed where the most significant activity was happening. The subsurface sections have the highest density of marks and also the highest structural complexity in the patterns. Whatever was happening in those sections, ARC considered it worth marking extensively. The spatial relationship between the marks and the monitoring equipment that Ark preserved is also notable. Many of the most complex mark clusters are positioned in direct visual relationship to specific instruments in the preserved monitoring array, not on the instruments, not blocking them, but adjacent to them in ways that suggest the marks and the instruments are part of the same system of reference. Ark was not just using the human instruments. Ark was labeling them or annotating them or placing them in a context of its own making. What that context means is where interpretation becomes difficult. One reading is that Ark was creating a record of its own activities in the language of its own marking system, positioned alongside the human record represented by the instruments. A parallel archive, a record that would be readable to any future Ark presence at the site without needing to interface with the human documentation. Another reading is more functional. The marks are not records but instructions placed to guide subsequent Ark operations at the site. The concentration in the most operationally significant areas and the positioning relative to the monitoring equipment could be a map, a guide to what to do and where to do it for Ark forces that arrive later. The marks as operating manual rather than as record. A third reading, and the one I find most consistent with the broader framework this video has been building, is that the marks are neither a record nor instructions, but an acknowledgement. A marking of significant locations in a way that recognizes their significance, rather than recording or directing. Like cairns on a mountain trail, they mark passage and presence, without necessarily conveying specific information. Ark passed through here, engaged with this, recognized this as important. The marks as memorial, rather than message. The memorial reading is evocative because it implies something about Ark's relationship to time and to the significance of its own activities. If Ark marks significant moments and locations in ways that persist beyond the immediate operational need, Ark has a relationship to its own history that includes something like commemoration, that is a more complex and more humanly relatable quality than the image of Ark as pure function suggests. The archivist's documents contain a brief discussion of the marks that is interesting for its restraint. The archivist notes their existence, describes their distribution accurately, and then says something that has been quoted widely in the community. I cannot read them, but I believe they are trying to say the same thing we were trying to say. The difference is that they know what they are saying and we were guessing. That observation, coming from someone who spent years trying to understand the gate, has the quality of a genuine insight arrived at from a position of hard-won knowledge. The archivist believes Ark and the human researchers were engaged in a parallel project of trying to express something about the gate in their respective systems. The humans in the language of scientific instrumentation and documentation, Ark in whatever system the marks represent. The difference is not in what they were pointing at, but in whether they understood what they were pointing at. Ark knew. The humans were guessing. If that reading is right, the marks are not alien in the sense of being wholly foreign. They are attempting to express something about the same phenomenon that the human archive was also attempting to express. In principle, if you could read the marks and read the human archive in relation to each other, you would have two different ways of saying the same thing, and the comparison might allow you to understand both better than either alone would permit. This is one of the most intriguing potential research programs suggested by the Blue Gate law, not trying to decode Ark script in isolation, the marks without context, but trying to read them alongside the human documents as complementary attempts to express a shared subject. The point of maximum mark density in the subsurface sections alongside the point of maximum human document density. About those same sections, read together, might resolve ambiguities that neither resolves alone. Whether such a reading has been attempted in the game's world, whether any character or group is engaged in this kind of comparative work, is something the law hints at without confirming. There are references in some documents to people who worked with both Ark-left materials and human archive materials in ways that suggest they were attempting exactly this kind of comparison. Whether they made progress, and whether any conclusions they reached are accessible somewhere in the game world, is a thread that future law reveals may address. The marks at Blue Gate a reminder that the Blue Gate story is not just a human story with Ark as antagonist. It is a story in which both humans and Ark are responding to and trying to express something larger than either. The marks and the documents are both attempts at comprehension that exceed the comprehender's full capacity. They are both archives of an encounter with something that resists complete understanding but rewards sustained attention. Blue Gate, as a physical space, is saturated with these two sets of marks, human and Ark, layered on top of each other across time. Walking through the facility is walking through a conversation between two parties who never quite managed to speak directly to each other, but who were, throughout everything, trying to say the same thing. Chapter 14, The Threshold Theory. In the final chapters of this video, we are going to bring together everything we have built and try to assemble the most complete picture of what Ark's goal at Blue Gate was, that the available evidence supports. This chapter is about a specific theoretical framework, what I will call the threshold theory, which I think provides the most coherent account of everything the Blue Gate law describes. The threshold theory begins with the monitoring data trend we discussed in Chapter 12. The observation that the gate's connectivity values are moving in a consistent direction toward what the archivist called a saturation point. The theory proposes that this saturation point is not an arbitrary number, but a genuine threshold, a level at which the gate's function changes qualitatively rather than quantitatively. Below the threshold, the gate is what it has been, a place where the rules are different, a thin place where the substrate is close to the surface, a point of anomalous but bounded connection. Above the threshold, the gate becomes something different in kind. What it becomes is not something the monitoring records can tell us, because no record of a gate at or beyond the saturation threshold exists in the human archive. But the threshold theory proposes that reaching saturation represents the gate completing a process that has been engaged in for a very long time, longer than human awareness of it, longer perhaps than human civilization. The gate is not a static anomaly. It is a dynamic process that has been building towards something. The threshold theory is consistent with everything Ark's behavior at Blue Gate suggests. Ark is not there to exploit the gate before it reaches its threshold. Ark is there to be present when the threshold is crossed. Ark's sustained, patient, rhythmically synchronized presence at the site is the behavior of something that knows the process is underway and knows that it cannot be rushed, only attended to. Ark is waiting for the gate to do what the gate has been doing all along. Why Ark wants to be present when the threshold is crossed is the theory's most difficult component. The simplest answer, consistent with the framework from Chapter 11, is that the threshold crossing will alter the accessibility of the foundational substrate that both the gate and Ark express. If the gate reaching saturation means that the substrate becomes more directly accessible, Ark's presence is motivated by the same thing that motivates its ordinary relationship to the gate, staying connected to what it is made of, and being present when that connection becomes more available. A more complex answer involves what the threshold crossing might mean for the relationship between the human world and Ark's substrate. If the gate is a thin place where the rules are different, saturation might represent the rules becoming different across a wider area or across the entirety of the physical world. The gate's process completing would not just change conditions at Blue Gate, it would change conditions everywhere. That possibility is what gives the threshold theory its largest implications. Ark's goal at Blue Gate, under the most expansive reading of the threshold theory, was not site-specific, it was global. Blue Gate was the location of the process, but the outcome of the process would not be bounded to Blue Gate. Ark was managing the site where the threshold would be crossed, because that is where the management needed to happen, not because its interests were limited to that location. Whether the threshold crossing would be beneficial or harmful to the human world is not a question the threshold theory can answer from within the law evidence. The evidence does not tell us what the changed conditions would look like, or what they would mean for human survival and civilization. But the framework of Ark's behavior suggests that Ark does not experience the threshold crossing as threatening. It experiences it as something to be present for, something to be aligned with, something that represents the completion of a process fundamental to Ark's own nature. That Ark's completion might be catastrophic for humans, and that Ark's indifference to human outcomes is not hostility, but simply the absence of any framework in which human outcomes matter to Ark's own process, is the most genuinely frightening implication of the threshold theory. Not Ark as enemy, but Ark as a process that is happening on a scale and in a dimension where human concerns simply do not register. The human researchers at Bluegate were trying to study the threshold process from the outside, with instruments designed for a different kind of investigation in a cultural context that gave them no frameworks for understanding what they were dealing with. The informal network had more knowledge, but based on the evidence, no more ability to influence the process than the official program. Ark was managing the site because Ark could perceive what the site actually was and needed. Everyone else was working at a remove that made meaningful engagement with the process itself essentially impossible. Where the Raiders fit in this picture is the question that the game's ongoing narrative is presumably building toward. The Raiders operate in the ruins of a world shaped by Ark's incursions, in a facility that is specifically the site of a threshold process approaching completion. Whether the Raiders can do anything about that process, whether the knowledge preserved in the archivist's archive is relevant to that possibility, whether the informal network's surviving members have capabilities that matter, are the questions that Bluegate's lore is ultimately organized around asking. The threshold theory does not make the Raiders powerless. It makes their situation clear. They are operating in a specific place, at a specific time, on the edge of a process that is going to complete regardless of what they do. What they can choose is whether to understand that process, whether to engage with it on terms other than reactive conflict, whether to use the tools that the people who came before them left behind. The archivist's archive, the monitoring instruments Ark preserved, the marks Ark left alongside those instruments, the knowledge carried by the survivors of the informal network. All of it is there, in the ruins of Bluegate, waiting to be read by someone who is paying attention. The threshold has not yet been crossed. The gate's trend line is still approaching saturation. There is still time, in whatever sense time applies to a process like this, for someone to develop a deeper understanding of what is happening and what it means. Whether that time will be used, and by whom, and to what end, is where the Bluegate story leaves us, and it is where Ark Raiders as a game positions its players. In the ruins of a facility that was always going to be the site of something enormous, with access to the fragments of multiple attempts to understand and engage with that something, and with the choice of what to do with that access. Ark's goal at Bluegate was to be present for the threshold. The question for everyone else is what their goal is going to be. Chapter 15. What we still don't know. This final chapter is intentionally different from the others. The previous 14 chapters have been building a picture, arguing toward a specific interpretation of Bluegate's law, assembling evidence into frameworks, and frameworks into conclusions. This chapter is about the limits of that process, the things we genuinely do not know, and that the current state of the law cannot tell us, the questions that remain fully open and that represent the edges of this video's investigation. The most important thing we do not know is what actually happened in the subsurface sections of Bluegate during Ark's high-intensity operational phases. All of our knowledge of those operations is second-hand, filtered through observers who could not see directly into those areas and who were describing secondary evidence. We have inferred a great deal from that secondary evidence, and I believe the inferences are well supported. But inference is not observation. And the gap between what the observers could see and what was actually happening in those sections is a fundamental limitation on everything built on top of it. The second thing we do not know is what the gate actually is at the level of mechanism. The archivist's framework, the monitoring data, the physical evidence of the facility's changes, all of this builds a functional picture of something that exhibits goal-directed behavior, that shows consistent dynamics over time, that responds to engagement. But the substrate level description of what this thing actually consists of, how it is organized, what kind of entity or process it represents, is entirely absent from the available evidence. We can describe what it does, we cannot describe what it is. The third unknown is the status and activities of the informal network after the incursion. We established that members of this group survived and carried knowledge with them. We have no documentation of what they did with that knowledge or where they currently operate in the game's world. This is one of the lore threads most likely to be developed in future game content, and when that development comes, it will potentially change our understanding of what Bluegate's story means in the broader context of Ark Raider's world. The fourth unknown is Ark's timeline and perspective. We have been reading Ark's behavior at Bluegate from the outside through human observation and human documents. We have no Ark perspective accounts of what the operations felt like from the inside, what Ark understood it was doing, what it hoped to achieve at the operational level. The marks Ark left are potentially a source of this perspective, but without the ability to read them, they remain opaque. The fifth unknown is the most personal and the most poignant. We do not know what happened to the archivist. We have their documents, their framework, their final incomplete transmission. We do not know if they survived the incursion, what they carried with them if they did, whether they continued their work elsewhere, whether they reached any further conclusions that they never had the opportunity to write down. The archivist, as a person, is as much a mystery as the gate they spent their career studying. The sixth unknown is the one that determines whether any of the rest of it matters in practical terms, the timeline to saturation. The archivist's projection said it was closer than expected, but the projection was made at a specific point in the monitoring record's timeline and with specific methodological limitations. The current distance to saturation is unknown, and the rate of approach may not be constant. The trend is real. How long it runs before completion is not known. The seventh unknown is perhaps the most fundamental, what we call Ark. Throughout this video, we have been using that name as if it identifies a clear and bounded entity. But the evidence from Bluegate specifically, the substrate framework, the threshold theory, the gate's relationship to Ark's internal coherence, all of it suggests that the boundary between Ark and the world is not as clear as the name implies. Ark is not simply out there doing things to a world it is separate from. Ark and the world share a foundation. The gate is where that shared foundation is most visible. If Ark is not simply the other but is in some sense part of the same foundational substrate as the human world, then the conflict framing that Ark Raiders presents as its surface-level narrative is not wrong but is incomplete. The Raiders fighting Ark units at Blue Gate are not just fighting invaders, they are fighting at the boundary of a process that involves the world they stand on, as much as it involves the entities they are fighting. That is a genuinely vertiginous thought to sit with, and I want to sit with it for a moment rather than resolving it too quickly. The Raiders, the humans, the researchers who came before them, all of them are in a world that is connected to whatever Ark is through something that has been building in thin places like Blue Gate for a very long time. The conflict is real, the danger is real. But underneath the conflict, something more fundamental is happening that the conflict does not fully describe. What would it mean to engage with that more fundamental process rather than only fighting its surface expression? The Blue Gate lore, I believe, is ultimately asking that question. The archive is there, the instruments are there, the marks are there. The framework exists, incomplete and fragmentary, for developing a deeper kind of engagement than the combat loop of Raiders versus Ark units in the ruins. Whether that deeper engagement is possible, whether it would be beneficial, whether it would change anything about the threshold approach, are questions the game has not answered and may not answer for a long time. But Blue Gate, as a location and as a lore document, is positioned as the place where those questions are most alive. The facility's ruins contain more than the remnants of a conflict. They contain the remnants of multiple serious attempts to understand something that exceeds ordinary understanding, and the invitation to continue those attempts. The things we do not know about Blue Gate are not failures of the lore. They are the lore's most honest quality, a story about an encounter with something genuinely beyond current human comprehension should not be fully comprehensible. The gaps in our knowledge of Blue Gate mirror the gaps in the character's knowledge within the world. We are positioned as investigators of the same mystery the archivist was investigating, with more distance and less danger, but the same fundamental limitation. We are trying to describe something from outside that can only be fully known from inside. Ark knew Blue Gate from inside. The gate is part of what Arc is. We are trying to understand it from the position of observers, with instruments designed for observation, with frameworks built from the outside looking in. The archivist got closer than anyone, and the archivist's final transmission broke off mid-sentence. Blue Gate does not give you resolution. It gives you a direction. It gives you the shape of a question that is worth spending as much time with as it demands. It gives you an archive built by someone who believed that understanding mattered even when it was incomplete, even when it was dangerous, even when the thing being understood was approaching a threshold that no one could see past. The gate is still there. The trend is still moving. Arc is still positioned around what it has always been positioned around. And the archive, in whatever fragmented state it survives, is still waiting for the person who is paying close enough attention to read it in full. You said, continue, for an additional 8 hours continue, for an additional 8 hours too. 155 Claude responded, Chapter 16, The Architecture of Silence. Chapter 16, The Architecture of Silence. Every location in Arc Raiders communicates through what is absent as much as through what is present, and Blue Gate is the most eloquent example of this principle in the entire game. The silences in the Blue Gate record are not accidental, they are structured, they have shapes, and reading those shapes is as important as reading anything that was explicitly documented and left behind. The most significant silence in the Blue Gate archive is the almost total absence of official communication about the monitoring program from the facility to any external institutional authority. A research program of this scale and apparent significance would normally generate a substantial outward flow of reporting. Progress reports, budget justifications, findings summaries, requests for additional resources or personnel. All the bureaucratic apparatus of a major classified project. At Blue Gate, this outward flow is nearly non-existent. The inward flow is well documented. Materials came in, personnel came in, equipment came in, instructions and authorizations came in, but almost nothing went back out through official channels. The monitoring program, for all its years of operation, produced a remarkably thin official record at the institutional level. Either the reports were sent and were subsequently destroyed, or classified at a level above what survives in the zone's documents, or the reports were never sent in the standard way because the program was operating outside standard oversight structures. The second possibility is more interesting. A program that receives institutional resources but does not generate institutional reports is either a program that has captured its oversight structure so completely that reporting is unnecessary, or a program that is operating with a kind of authorization that does not require ongoing accountability. Both of these are unusual institutional arrangements, and both imply that someone in a position of significant authority had decided that Blue Gate should be managed differently from other classified programs. Who made that decision, and why is not documented in the available record? But the shape of the silence is suggestive. Programs that bypass normal oversight structures tend to do so either because their subject matter is so sensitive that standard reporting channels are considered insecure, or because the people running them have reasons to keep their activities away from institutional scrutiny, even within the classified world. The first reason is a security argument. The second is something more personal. The third possibility, which combines elements of both, is that the people who authorized the Blue Gate program knew that its subject matter was something that institutional oversight structures were not equipped to evaluate, and that subjecting it to normal review processes would generate interference that would impede rather than support the work. If you are running a program to study something that your oversight authorities would either dismiss as nonsense or react to with panic, keeping it out of standard reporting channels is a rational choice from the program's perspective, even if it is an irregular one from the institution's perspective. Whatever the reason for the silence, its effect was to leave the Blue Gate program essentially isolated from the institutional context that might have provided additional resources, additional expertise, or additional pressure towards particular approaches. The isolation that the observatory engagement tension operated within was a genuine isolation. There was no external authority to appeal to, no outside expert to bring in, no institutional review process to force a resolution. The factions within the program had only each other and the data. That isolation shaped the internal culture of the facility in ways the personal logs make visible. The intensity of the relationships, the depth of the personal investment in the work, the bitterness of the factional disagreements. All of these are partly explicable by the isolation. When your work is cut off from external validation or critique, the internal social dynamics of the work community become everything. The observatory and engagement factions were not just disagreeing about research methodology, they were, in a context of near total isolation, fighting about meaning. The silence extends to another dimension as well. The absence of external expert engagement with the monitoring data. In standard research practice, anomalous findings are shared, at least within trusted communities, to get outside perspectives and to build collective understanding. Bluegate's data was not shared. The archivist was the most systematic thinker working with it, and even the archivist had no access to comparable work by anyone else. No previous studies of similar phenomena to situate their observations within, no community of practice to think alongside. This intellectual isolation is one of the most significant constraints on the Bluegate research program, and it shows in the archivist's documents. There are points where the archivist is clearly reaching for concepts that the available vocabulary does not contain, struggling to express observations for which no adequate language exists, because no one has needed that language before. If the program had been connected to a broader community of researchers working on comparable phenomena, some of that language might have already existed. The isolation forced the archivist to build conceptual tools from scratch that a connected research community might have developed faster and more completely. The silence around Bluegate also shaped what happened when ARC arrived. An isolated program that has not shared its findings has no prepared institutional response to its own discoveries, no protocol for how to handle the moment when the thing it has been studying does something extraordinary. The rapid departure from the facility was partly shaped by the isolation. There was no external framework to fall back on, no pre-existing emergency plan that accounted for what the facility was actually studying, because no one outside the inner circle knew what the facility was actually studying. A well-connected program with robust external relationships would have had somewhere to send its most critical findings in the moment of crisis. A secure channel to an external authority that understood the significance of what was at stake. Bluegate had no such channel. The archivist's decision to create the archive in place, to leave it for a future discoverer rather than transmit it to a safe external repository, was not just a matter of personal preference, it was the only option available. The architecture of silence around Bluegate is in the end one of the most important structural features of the entire story. It is the silence that made the archivist's archive necessary. It is the silence that allowed the informal network to develop outside official structures, without encountering institutional resistance. It is the silence that meant ARC's arrival at the facility encountered no prepared external response. And it is the silence that means most of what happened at Bluegate remains unknown to the game's broader world, preserved only in fragments that require the kind of sustained, close attention this video represents. Silence is not just the absence of sound, it is a medium. The silence around Bluegate carries information about power, about fear, about the institutional management of knowledge that exceeds institutional capacity, about the ways that the most important things are sometimes kept most carefully from the systems that should know about them. Reading the silence is part of reading the story. The facility's physical architecture reflects this in interesting ways. Bluegate was not designed with the kind of redundant communication infrastructure that standard classified installations typically feature. The communication systems that exist are minimal, designed for internal coordination rather than robust external connection. The facility was built to be self-contained, and its self-containment was maintained long after the original logistical rationale for it had been replaced by the research program. The silence was infrastructurally supported. It was built into the walls. Whatever institutional authority authorized and maintained the Bluegate program had made a decision, probably early in the facility's history, that what was at Bluegate should stay at Bluegate. The resources would flow in, the findings would not flow out. The facility would be cared for, maintained, staffed with capable people, but it would be held at arm's length from the institutions that supported it, close enough to fund, far enough to remain ignorant. That arrangement served someone's interests. Figuring out whose interests it served and why would tell you a great deal about who actually knew about Bluegate at the institutional level and what they understood about it. The silence was maintained by people. People who chose to maintain it, who had the power to maintain it, and who had reasons for that choice that the available law does not directly reveal. Those people are connected to the informal network we discussed in Chapter 10. The unofficial knowledge of Bluegate that circulated outside the facility's own inner circle was circulating in a context defined by the official silence. The informal network was not simply filling in gaps left by open information. It was operating in the space created by a deliberate suppression, and its members knew what that suppression meant. They knew that official silence around something does not mean nothing is there. It means something is there that the official structures cannot handle. The silence and the informal network are two sides of the same institutional reality. The silence created the space, the network moved into it, and both of them shaped the conditions under which ARC eventually arrived at a facility, whose significance was simultaneously the most carefully kept secret and the most widely rumoured phenomenon in its regional context. Chapter 17. The Other Blue Gates. Bluegate is one location, but the logic of what Bluegate is, a site where the foundational substrate of the world is unusually accessible, a thin place where the connectivity values are higher than background, a location that exhibits self-directed perturbations and structural anomalies and an apparent trend towards something, is not logic that is unique to one place. The game's broader lore, if you read it with the Bluegate framework in mind, contains evidence for comparable sites elsewhere. This chapter is about those other Bluegates and what they tell us about the scale of the process Bluegate represents. The evidence for comparable sites is distributed and requires assembly from documents that do not explicitly reference Bluegate. The technique is pattern recognition, looking for documents in other zones that describe phenomena whose characteristics match the Bluegate framework. Unusual structural anomalies, unexplained monitoring programs, concentrated arc presence, disproportionate to any obvious strategic value, references to connectivity or linkage in measurement contexts, environmental behaviors that exceed normal physical explanation. These patterns appear in enough locations across the game to support the conclusion that Bluegate is not unique as a type. It may be unique in intensity or in the amount of human attention it received, but the foundational condition it represents, the thin place, the exposed substrate, appears to be a feature of the game's world in multiple locations. What this means for the threshold theory from Chapter 14 is significant. If the threshold is a property of individual sites, then Bluegate's saturation would be a local event with potentially contained consequences. But if the various thin places in the game's world are connected, if they represent a distributed network of substrate exposure rather than isolated points, then what happens when one of them saturates might propagate through the network. Bluegate, reaching its threshold, might not just change conditions at Bluegate, it might change conditions at every comparable site. The connectivity measurements at Bluegate, the relational values that the monitoring program was tracking, might be measuring not just the intensity of the gate's own exposure, but the gate's degree of connection to this distributed network. As Bluegate's values trend upward toward saturation, it may be because it is becoming more deeply integrated with the other nodes in the network, drawing strength or proximity from connections that were always there but that are strengthening over time. This network model of the thin places has implications for ARC's behavior that go beyond Bluegate. If ARC is present at multiple comparable sites across the game world, as the cross-zone evidence suggests, then ARC's operational pattern at those sites should resemble what we see at Bluegate: cycling activity, specialist deployment, maintenance of human monitoring instruments where they exist, marks of specific types in specific areas. Checking those predictions against what the law describes at other locations is one of the most productive research directions the Bluegate framework opens up. The strongest candidate for a comparable site in the available law is a location that is referenced in documents from a different zone as a site of unexplained arc density and unusual physical properties. The references are brief and indirect, but the combination of characteristics, concentrated arc presence, without obvious strategic rationale, physical anomalies of a specific kind, a fragmentary human research history, matches the Blue Gate profile closely enough to be suggestive. If that site is comparable to Blue Gate, but at a different point in its development, either earlier or later in the trend towards saturation, comparing the two could provide information about the trajectory of the process that neither site alone can supply. An earlier site would show what Blue Gate looked like before its current intensity. A later site would show what Blue Gate is moving toward. The possibility of a more advanced site, one that is further along the trend than Blue Gate, is the most consequential implication of the network model. If such a site exists, and if the law contains evidence of what happens as a site approaches saturation more closely than Blue Gate has yet done, then the blank space in the threshold theory, the unknown character of saturation itself, might be partially illuminable. The documents that appear most relevant to this question are frustratingly vague. They describe a location where conditions are described as more intense than anything in the Blue Gate record, where arc forces have maintained an extraordinarily sustained presence, and where certain physical phenomena that the Blue Gate law describes as occasional or temporary appear to be constant. The rules that are different at Blue Gate appear to be more comprehensively different at this other location. If the rule difference is a function of how close the site is to saturation, this more advanced site is closer. What the documents say about that more advanced site's current status is ambiguous in a way that might be deliberate. The most recent references to it in the available law are older than the most recent Blue Gate references. The site seems to have dropped out of the documentary record at some point. Either nothing significant happened there recently enough to generate new documentation, or something happened that has not been documented yet, or the site was involved in events that are deliberately not documented in the accessible archive. The last possibility is the most suggestive. If the advanced site was the location of an earlier threshold approach, and if what happened there informed Ark's behavior at Blue Gate, then understanding what happened there is directly relevant to predicting what will happen when Blue Gate reaches its own threshold. Ark arrived at Blue Gate with experience. The experience came from somewhere. The more advanced site is the most plausible candidate for where that experience was developed. The question of what happened at the more advanced site is one of the deepest outstanding questions in the broader Ark Raiders lore, and it connects directly to the Blue Gate investigation in ways that make it a priority for future research. If Ark was present at a site that reached saturation, and if Ark survived that event and retained the organizational coherence to subsequently deploy at Blue Gate, then either the saturation event was not catastrophically destructive to Ark, or Ark's relationship to the threshold allows it to endure what other entities might not. What about humans? Were humans present at the more advanced site when it reached or approached saturation? Were there researchers, informal network members, survivors who experienced whatever happened there? The documentary silence around that site is the same kind of structured silence we identified around Blue Gate in the previous chapter. The absence of documentation is not evidence of absence of events. It is evidence of events that someone or something ensured did not get documented. The network of comparable sites implied by the Blue Gate law and partially visible in cross-zone documents is one of the most important large-scale structures in Ark Raiders world building. Blue Gate is a node in a network that covers a significant portion of the game's world, and the process that Blue Gate represents is playing out at all the nodes simultaneously, at different rates and intensities but all trending in the same direction.